Chapter 1. The Woman in Room 47. It is with some reluctance that I set down the particulars of the singular affair, which came afterward to be known in certain circles as the case of the dead woman inside Room 47. Though many years have elapsed since those extraordinary events unfolded beneath the smoky skies of London, I confess there remains about the memory of it a peculiar uneasiness unlike that attached to any other adventure which I shared with my friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. There are mysteries which astonish by their ingenuity. There are crimes which appall through brutality, but this case possessed an altogether different quality. A kind of creeping irrationality which, for a time, appeared to place it beyond the reach of logic itself. And yet, if I have learned anything from Sherlock Holmes, it is that the impossible merely masks a truth not yet properly observed. Began upon a bitter evening in November of 1894. A yellow fog rolled low through Baker Street, muffling the clatter of hansom cabs and dimming the gas lamps into pale orange smears. Holmes lounged upon the settee in our sitting room, 221B. His long fingers pressed together beneath his chin, while he regarded the fire with an expression of profound abstraction. For my own part, I had spent the evening attempting to organise certain medical papers, though Holmes's violin, lying silent beside his chair, suggested that my companion's mind had drifted far from music and deep into one of those mental labyrinths from which only the promise of intellectual stimulation could retrieve him. "You are bored, Holmes," said I at last. He gave the faintest smile without moving his eyes from the fire. "My dear Watson, you continue to improve. Another 6 months in my company, and you may become positively observant. You have scarcely spoken for 2 hours. A talkative man may still be entertained. You have not touched your tobacco, either. Excellent. And when you are bored," I continued, warming to my deduction, "you neglect even the chemical monograph beside your chair." Holmes slowly turned his head. "Very fair indeed, Watson. Though you miss the central point. And what is that? I am not merely bored. I am dangerously understimulated. London, at present, insists upon supplying me with nothing beyond fraudulent jewel thefts and husbands convinced their wives are poisoning them because the soup tastes unusual. You solved both cases. Elementary affairs. One could as easily derive excitement from balancing accounts." I laughed. "Then perhaps London prepares something more suitable for you." "It had better do so quickly," said Holmes dryly, "or I may be forced to take up politics merely for entertainment." At that instant there came a violent knocking below, followed by hurried footsteps ascending the stair. Mrs. Hudson entered in visible agitation. "There's a gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes. Says it's a matter a life and death." Holmes sat upright immediately. The transformation in him was astonishing. His languor vanished like mist before sunlight. "Show him in." A moment later our visitor entered, a tall, narrow-faced man of perhaps 40 years, dressed with the severe neatness of a professional gentleman. His dark overcoat glistened with fog moisture, and his gloves trembled perceptibly as he removed them. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, at your service. I am Dr. Julius Renwick of St. Bartholomew's Hospital." Holmes gestured toward a chair. "Pray sit down, Dr. Renwick. This is my friend and colleague, Dr. Watson." The newcomer bowed distractedly in my direction but remained standing. "I fear there has been a dreadful occurrence." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "A murder?" Renwick swallowed. "I scarcely know what to call it." That answer alone was enough to seize Holmes's full attention. "Proceed." The doctor passed a trembling hand across his brow. "At approximately 8:30 this evening, the management of the Ashburton Grand Hotel requested my immediate presence. A chambermaid had discovered the body of a woman in room 47. Holmes leaned back slightly. "A commonplace enough beginning." "So it would seem," Renwick answered quietly, "but the circumstances are not commonplace." "The woman was murdered?" "Yes." "How?" "A deep puncture wound directly beneath the left clavicle. Instantaneous death, most likely." "And yet you hesitate." Because, said the doctor slowly, the room was locked from the inside. A suicide, then? No weapon was found. Holmes's eyes flashed, with sudden interest. Ah, Renwick continued. The windows were bolted, the chimney too narrow for passage. No concealed entrance exists. The hotel manager himself forced open the door in my presence. And the woman? She had been dead at least 4 hours. A long silence settled across the room. Then Holmes rose abruptly and crossed toward the mantelpiece. You have photographs? Renwick removed an envelope from inside his coat. I anticipated you might ask. Holmes drew the photographs into the lamplight. I observed his face carefully as he examined them one by one. Few men could conceal thought as completely as Sherlock Holmes. Yet certain tiny signs betrayed him to those who knew him well. The narrowing eyelids, the slight movement of the lips, the rigid stillness which overtook him when his intellect fully awakened. At length he handed me the photographs. I confess they sent a chill through me. The dead woman lay half reclined, beside a velvet chaise, in what appeared to be a luxurious hotel suite. She was young, perhaps no more than 30, with dark hair arranged fashionably beneath a jewelled comb. Her expression was not one of terror, but rather profound surprise. Most striking of all was the room itself. Nothing appeared disturbed. No signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no blood beyond the tiny crimson mark upon her pale throat. And yet there existed one detail which instantly fixed itself upon my mind. Across the wallpaper above the fireplace, written in dark charcoal strokes, were the words, "She opened the door herself." I looked up sharply. Good heavens! Precisely, murmured Holmes. Renwick leaned forward anxiously. The police are there now. Inspector Lestrade has taken charge, but he confessed himself completely unable to explain the matter. When was the woman identified? She has not yet been identified. No luggage? None. Jewellery? A wedding ring? Nothing else. Holmes turned suddenly toward the doctor. Who occupied the adjoining rooms? Room 46 was empty. Room 48, occupied by a French textile merchant who heard nothing unusual. And the hotel staff? No one recalls seeing the woman enter. Holmes gave a soft whistle. A body appears inside a locked hotel room. The victim is unknown. The murder weapon vanishes. A message is left behind. And no witness observed her arrival. He smiled faintly. At last, Watson, London begins to apologise for its earlier mediocrity. You mean to take the case? My dear fellow, how could I possibly resist it? Within 15 minutes we were racing eastward, through the fog, in a hansom cab, while Holmes sat hunched forward, his keen face partially concealed beneath the brim of his travelling hat. You have formed a theory already, said I. Several. Then the thing is not impossible. Nothing is impossible, Holmes replied, only insufficiently examined. The streets grew progressively busier as we approached the Strand, where the great hotels and theatres blazed against the night like islands of gold amidst the murk. The Ashburton Grand Hotel stood upon a prominent corner, a magnificent modern establishment frequented by wealthy travellers and foreign dignitaries. Its entrance glittered with polished brass and electric lamps newly installed the previous year. A uniformed porter admitted us at once. Inside, agitation reigned. Hotel clerks whispered anxiously behind the desk, while nervous guests clustered in parlours, speaking in subdued voices. At the far end of the lobby stood Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, small, wiry and sharp-faced as a terrier. He greeted Holmes with evident relief. Thank heaven, you've come. Holmes removed his gloves calmly. You appear disturbed, Lestrade, and with reason. I've seen strange business in my time, Mr. Holmes, but this. He broke off with a frustrated gesture. You have examined the room thoroughly, twice over, and, Lestrade lowered his voice, there's no way in or out. Holmes's smile broadened slightly. Excellent. The inspector stared. You call it excellent. A problem without complexity offers little instructional value. Lestrade grunted impatiently. Well, you may find this one educational enough to last the winter. He led us upstairs. The corridors upon the 4th floor were heavily carpeted and brightly lit by gas sconces, whose golden glow did little to dispel the oppressive atmosphere hanging over the place. 2 constables guarded the entrance to room 47. Lestrade unlocked the door. "You'll observe," said he, "that the lock remains undamaged save where forced by the manager." Holmes bent instantly over the mechanism. What time was the door broken? 9 o'clock exactly. And the body discovered? 5 minutes earlier by a maid attempting evening service. Holmes entered without replying. I followed close behind and stopped dead. The room was extraordinarily elegant. Dark crimson wallpaper, heavy velvet curtains, a coal fire burning low in the grate, crystal lamps casting soft amber light across polished furnishings. And there, beside the chaise, exactly as shown in the photographs, lay the dead woman. Even Holmes paused momentarily. Death had scarcely diminished her beauty. Indeed, the stillness lent her face an almost sculptural calm. Holmes crossed silently to the corpse and knelt. "What was your conclusion, Doctor?" "Renwick. Instant death caused by penetration of a narrow blade or instrument into the subclavian artery. No defensive wounds. None." Holmes gently lifted one pale hand. "Interesting. What is?" "The fingernails." I bent nearer. There were traces of black dust beneath them. Holmes sniffed delicately. "Coal soot." Lestrade frowned. "There's soot all over London." "Indeed. Yet one wonders why a fashionable woman acquires it beneath freshly manicured nails." Holmes rose and began pacing slowly about the room. No movement escaped him. He examined the carpet fibres with a lens, measured distances between furnishings, tested the window latches, inspected even the hinges of the wardrobe. At length he halted before the message upon the wall. She opened the door. Herself Holmes studied it for a full minute. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed. "You perceive something amusing?" asked Lestrade irritably. "Very much so." "Well," Holmes pointed toward the writing. "The final word." Lestrade stared blankly. "What about it?" "It was written by a left-handed man, attempting unsuccessfully to imitate right-handed penmanship." The inspector blinked. "How the devil?" "The downward pressure changes abruptly upon each terminal stroke." "Elementary." He stepped back again. "But that is not the truly interesting feature." "What is?" Holmes's eyes glittered. "The message is false." A silence followed. "You mean the murderer lied?" "No, Lestrade. I mean the message itself was never intended to be believed." "Then why write it?" Holmes turned slowly toward the dead woman. "That," said he softly, "is the first genuinely important question in this affair." And as he spoke those words, the wind outside gave a sudden mournful cry against the hotel windows, while somewhere, deep below, in the streets of London, a church bell struck 10. Chapter 2. The Ashes Beneath Her Fingernails. There are occasions in my recollection of Sherlock Holmes when I have observed his mind advance with such astonishing rapidity that ordinary conversation became almost impossible. At such moments he seemed less a man than some finely constructed engine of logic. Every faculty narrowed toward a single objective. The investigation of the woman in room 47 placed him in precisely such a condition. For nearly an hour after his examination of the corpse, Holmes traversed the chamber with tireless concentration, while Lestrade and I looked on in varying degrees of bewilderment. He spoke scarcely at all, save for abrupt questions delivered with the sharpness of pistol shots. "Who first entered after the door was forced?" "The hotel manager, myself, and Doctor." "Renwick," said Lestrade. "None touched the body." "No. The windows have remained secured." "Yes. No servant entered earlier during the evening." "No admit to it." Holmes grunted softly and dropped once more to his knees, beside the hearthrug. The coal fire had burned low, leaving the grate filled with dull crimson embers beneath a crust of grey ash. Holmes stirred them carefully with the poker, then suddenly froze. "Ah!" Lestrade leaned forward eagerly. "What is it?" Without answering, Holmes reached delicately into the ashes with a pair of brass tongs and extracted something so small that I could scarcely perceive it. He carried it beneath the gas lamp. It was a fragment of pale blue paper, no larger than a postage stamp, partially burned at the edges. Holmes turned it over between finger and thumb. "Watson." "Yes." "What do you make of this?" I examined it closely. "There appears to be writing upon it." "Excellent. Continue." "A printed number, perhaps?" Holmes nodded approvingly. "Very good indeed." Lestrade snatched impatiently for the scrap. "Well, the number 4, said Holmes quietly. "Or more precisely, 47. Lestrade stared. "You mean this paper came from the room itself?" "No. I mean someone wished to destroy something bearing the number 47. That tells us nothing. On the contrary, it tells us our murderer destroys evidence selectively, rather than systematically. A most revealing habit." He slipped the fragment carefully into an envelope. Meanwhile, I had turned my attention again toward the dead woman. "There is something peculiar here, Holmes." "Undoubtedly. You must be more specific." I pointed toward her attire. "She is dressed for evening society, yet there is mud upon the hem of her gown." Holmes approached instantly. The stain was slight but visible, a smear of dark brown clay along the lower edge of the silk. Holmes crouched. "Not ordinary street mud." He touched it lightly. "Yellow clay mixed with chalk. You recognize it?" "Possibly." He glanced toward the ceiling thoughtfully, but not yet with certainty. Lestrade folded his arms. "Very well, Mr. Holmes. Let us hear your theory." "My dear Lestrade, theories are dangerous luxuries in the absence of complete data. You have one regardless, several. Most of them contradictory," the inspector sighed. "You always do this, and you always object to it." Holmes turned abruptly toward the door. "The corridor, if you please." We followed him outside. The 4th-floor passage stretched in both directions beneath a row of gas jets, whose wavering glow lent the carpet an oddly theatrical appearance. Holmes examined the floor carefully. "No marks," muttered Lestrade. "We already checked." Holmes ignored him. At length he halted beside the door to room 46. "This room is empty?" "Yes." "Unlocked?" Lestrade produced a key. The chamber beyond proved smaller and far less luxurious than room 47. Dust lay upon the mantelpiece, and the bed remained untouched. Holmes crossed directly to the communicating wall between the rooms. "Interesting." "What now?" asked Lestrade. Holmes pointed. Near the skirting board appeared a tiny abrasion upon the wallpaper scarcely visible without close inspection. "A scrape," I observed. "Precisely. Fresh. Produced by metal." Lestrade frowned. "There's no hidden panel, if that's what you're suggesting." Holmes tapped the wall lightly. The solid oak answered him. "No secret passage," he agreed. "But something metallic stood here recently." "What sort of thing?" "A narrow object approximately 6 feet in height." Lestrade gave an exasperated snort. "You can tell that from one scrape?" "No, from 3. Indeed, now that he indicated them, I perceived additional marks lower down. Holmes's eyes gleamed faintly. Curious. He examined the floorboards next, then suddenly asked, "Who cleaned this room last?" "A maid named Ellen Briggs. Fetch her." While Lestrade departed reluctantly in search of the servant, Holmes stood motionless in the centre of the chamber. "You are excited," said I quietly. "Profoundly. Then you begin to perceive the outline. Only shadows, Watson. Yet the shadows possess shape." Before I could press him further, the door opened, and Lestrade returned accompanied by a pale young chambermaid, whose frightened eyes darted nervously about the room. "This is Ellen Briggs." Holmes softened his voice at once, a quality in him little appreciated by those who knew only his colder exterior. "You need not fear, Miss Briggs. We merely require accuracy. When did you last enter this room?" "Yesterday afternoon, sir." "Was anything unusual here then?" "No, sir. No furniture moved." She hesitated. "Well," Holmes smiled gently. "Pray continue." "There was a tall stand near the wall, sir." "A stand?" "Yes, sir. Like what hotels use for hanging coats." Lestrade looked startled. "And it's gone now?" "Yes, sir." Holmes exchanged a quick glance with me. Excellent, Miss Briggs. One more question. Did you observe anyone remove it? No, sir. Thank you. You have been most helpful. When she had departed, Lestrade burst out. A coat stand. What importance can that possibly have? Holmes clasped his hands behind his back. My dear Lestrade, in every investigation, there arrives a moment when an apparently insignificant object assumes extraordinary importance. We have reached that moment. You think the murderer used the stand somehow? I think, said Holmes carefully, that the absence of the stand may prove more significant than the corpse itself. This pronouncement appeared to test even Lestrade's patience beyond endurance. A dead woman in a locked room, and you concern yourself with hotel furniture? Holmes smiled faintly. You observe, but you do not reason from observation. Well then, reason for me. Holmes turned suddenly toward the adjoining wall. What lies directly beneath these rooms? The hotel dining salon. And above, storage attics. Good. He looked thoughtful. Watson, kindly examine the ceiling. I obeyed somewhat uncertainly. The plaster overhead appeared perfectly ordinary, save for faint discolorations caused by gaslight smoke. Nothing unusual. Not even there, Holmes pointed with his cane. I narrowed my eyes. Near the corner above the wardrobe was a tiny circular mark, perhaps no larger than a coin. A stain? A puncture, Holmes corrected. Lestrade stepped closer. By heaven? Holmes nodded slowly. Exactly. The inspector stared upward in confusion. What does it mean? Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he returned to room 47, with astonishing abruptness, and positioned himself beside the dead woman. His gaze travelled upward toward the ceiling, then across toward the fireplace, then to the locked door. I saw the instant some internal mechanism of reasoning aligned within his mind. His entire expression changed. Not triumph, not certainty. Something far more dangerous. Alarm. Very rarely had I seen that particular look upon Sherlock Holmes's face, and never without reason. What is it? I demanded. Holmes spoke very quietly. The murderer is far cleverer than I initially supposed. Lestrade scoffed nervously. Surely you don't mean he vanished through the ceiling? No. Holmes raised one hand sharply for silence. Footsteps sounded in the corridor outside. Heavy, hurried. A constable appeared breathless in the doorway. Inspector. Yes, there's been another incident. Lestrade stiffened. What sort of incident? The night porter, sir. What about him? He's disappeared. For the briefest instant, absolute stillness fell across the room. Then Holmes seized his coat. How long ago? He was seen 10 minutes past 10, sir. Then vanished from the front desk. Name? Arthur Hale. Holmes's voice became razor-sharp. Age? 26. Appearance? Tall, dark hair, moustache. Holmes turned instantly to Lestrade. The porter knew something. You're certain? He has either fled or been removed. We descended at once to the hotel lobby where confusion now reigned openly. Guests crowded the staircase while servants whispered fearfully among themselves. The hotel manager, a florid gentleman named Pomeroy, wrung his hands in distress. This will ruin us, Mr. Holmes. Absolutely ruin us. When did you last speak with Hale? Shortly before 10, he seemed nervous. Nervous how? He kept glancing toward the staircase. Holmes's eyes sharpened. Did he say anything unusual? Pomeroy hesitated. Only one thing. Well? He asked whether the police had discovered how she entered the room. A silence followed. Interesting, murmured Holmes. Lestrade demanded. Did he know the woman? Not that I'm aware of. Holmes moved toward the porter's desk. What are you doing? Asked Lestrade. Looking. For what? For the thing everyone else has overlooked. He examined the desk rapidly. Ledger books, inkstands, telegraph slips. Then suddenly his fingers paused upon a small brass drawer beneath the counter. Locked. Holmes glanced toward the manager. Your key? Pomeroy handed it over reluctantly. Inside the drawer lay only 3 objects. A hotel memorandum pad, a half-empty tin of Turkish cigarettes, and a folded envelope. Holmes opened it carefully. Inside was a single banknote for £50. No message, no signature. Lestrade whistled softly. A bribe? Perhaps. Holmes held the envelope beneath his nose briefly. Tobacco. Well, naturally. There are cigarettes in the drawer. Not Turkish tobacco. He passed the envelope to me. A faint sweet odour lingered upon the paper. Cigars, said I. Holmes nodded. Excellent, Watson. Expensive cigars. Lestrade frowned. What does that matter? Holmes slipped the envelope into his pocket. It matters because our night porter could never afford them. The inspector crossed his arms stubbornly. You already suspect him? No, said Holmes quietly. I fear for him. That answer struck me forcibly. You think he may already be dead? Holmes did not reply. Instead, he strode suddenly toward the hotel entrance where the fog pressed thickly against the glass doors like drifting smoke. Outside, the street lamps glimmered weak and indistinct. Holmes stood utterly still for several moments. Then he spoke in a tone I had learned to distrust profoundly. We are behind the murderer. Lestrade gave an impatient shrug. Naturally. No, Holmes answered. You misunderstand me. He turned slowly. The crime in room 47 was planned long before tonight. Every detail prepared, every movement calculated. Then we'll uncover it. Perhaps, said Holmes. His eyes drifted once more toward the staircase, ascending into darkness above. But I begin to suspect the dead woman was never intended to be the true victim at all. Chapter 3. The Man Who Feared the Stairs. The disappearance of the night porter cast an immediate pall over the Ashburton Grand Hotel. What had begun as an isolated mystery now acquired the dreadful quality of an unfolding conspiracy, and even the most sceptical among us could no longer dismiss the affair as a mere curiosity of crime. Guests departed in nervous haste. Servants gathered in frightened clusters. The manager wandered about in a state bordering upon collapse. Yet amidst the growing panic, Sherlock Holmes alone appeared calmer than before. Indeed, it was often his way that the greater the complexity surrounding a case, the more singularly composed he became. His mind, once fully engaged, seemed to thrive upon danger, as another man might thrive upon applause. At 11:15, we established ourselves temporarily within the hotel manager's private office adjacent to the lobby. Lestrade sat hunched beside the fire, with visible irritation, while Holmes occupied himself examining the hotel registry beneath the glow of a green-shaded lamp. I had seldom seen him read with such concentration. Page after page flicked beneath his long fingers. Anything? I asked at length. Possibly. That is not an answer. It is the only honest one available at present. He stopped suddenly. Ah! Lestrade looked up sharply. Well? Holmes tapped a particular line in the registry. Room 47 was reserved 3 days ago under the name Mrs. Lydia Vale of Bath. And the dead woman? Almost certainly not Mrs. Lydia Vale. How can you tell? The handwriting. Lestrade stared. You identified forgery from a hotel signature? My dear fellow, one identifies character. Observe. He pushed the register toward us. The signature appeared elegant at first glance. Yet there existed a stiffness to certain letters, which even my untrained eye perceived once Holmes indicated them. The writer. Holmes continued. Possessed education but attempted refinement beyond natural habit. Note the exaggerated loop upon the capital V. Well, a woman raised among the upper classes would never form it so. Lestrade grunted. So the name's false. Entirely. Holmes closed the ledger. Furthermore, room 47 was paid in advance. Cash. That's not unusual. For ordinary travellers, no. For murderers, extremely practical. The inspector rose impatiently. Very well. We have a false name, a vanished porter, and a dead woman. What next? Holmes leaned back. We reconstruct the evening, minute by minute. He turned toward the manager. Mr. Pomeroy, kindly begin at 6 o'clock. The hotelier cleared his throat nervously. The dining salon opened at 6:30. Traffic was normal. Nothing unusual until shortly before 8. What occurred then? One of the maids reported hearing movement in room 47. Which maid? Jane Whitmore. Fetch her. While the manager departed, Holmes lit a cigarette and sank into thoughtful silence. I observed him carefully. You have formed an important conclusion, a dangerous one. You believe the porter assisted the murderer. I believe Arthur Hale knew more than he should. Then why disappear? Because, said Holmes quietly, someone else realized it. The maid arrived moments later, a fair-haired girl with reddened eyes and trembling hands. Holmes questioned her with remarkable gentleness. You heard sounds from room 47? Yes, sir. At what hour? A little before 8. What sort of sounds? She hesitated. Furniture moving, sir. Holmes and I exchanged glances. Anything else? I thought I heard a woman crying. Lestrade leaned forward instantly. Crying for help? No, sir. More like, she faltered, like she was frightened. How long did it continue? Only a minute or two. Did anyone enter or leave the room afterward? No, sir. Holmes narrowed his eyes. You are certain? Yes, yet someone must have entered eventually. I never saw them. Holmes thanked her and dismissed her kindly. The moment the door closed, Lestrade burst out. There, the woman was alive at 8. Undoubtedly. And dead by 9, almost certainly. So the murderer entered during that hour. Holmes exhaled cigarette smoke slowly, or was already present. A silence followed. Lestrade frowned. You mean hiding in the room? It remains possible. But where? Holmes's expression became distant. That, said he softly, is precisely the difficulty. At midnight we resumed examination of the upper floors. The hotel had grown eerily silent. Most guests had retreated behind locked doors, while constables maintained uneasy watch along the corridors. Holmes walked ahead with rapid strides, pausing only occasionally to inspect some detail invisible to the rest of us. As we approached room 47 once more, he stopped abruptly. Listen. Far below, faint through the silence, came the sound of a piano drifting upward from the hotel lounge. A melancholy waltz. Holmes tilted his head. Curious. What is? Asked Lestrade. The pianist made the same error twice. The inspector stared. For heaven's sake, man. Holmes waved him silent and moved onward. Inside room 47 the dead woman remained exactly as before, awaiting removal to the morgue. The flickering gaslight lent her features a spectral stillness. Holmes approached the fireplace once more. You observed soot beneath her fingernails earlier, said I. Yes. You think it significant? I think everything's significant until proven otherwise. He crouched beside the hearth. Watson's. Hand me the poker. I complied. Holmes inserted the iron rod deep into the chimney and probed carefully upward. Then suddenly there came a faint metallic click. Holmes froze. What was that? I whispered. Without answering, he withdrew the poker slowly. Attached near its tip was a thin strand of wire. Lestrade uttered an oath. Well, I'll be damned. Holmes examined the wire beneath the light. Steel. Connected to what? Holmes smiled faintly. Excellent question. He inserted the poker again, this time with even greater care. After several moments, he extracted a second object. A small metal hook. Holmes held it delicately between finger and thumb. Now even Lestrade fell silent. You understand something, said I. Partially. What was hidden in the chimney? Not hidden, Holmes corrected. Installed. For what purpose? Holmes did not answer directly. Instead, he crossed suddenly toward the wall opposite the fireplace and studied the puncture mark near the ceiling. Then he measured the distance from wall to hearth using his cane. At last he nodded slowly to himself. Yes. Lestrade folded his arms. Well, the locked room, Holmes murmured, was achieved mechanically. The inspector blinked. You mean the murderer locked the door from outside? No. Then what? Holmes turned. The room itself became the weapon. Before either of us could demand explanation, hurried footsteps sounded outside. A constable entered breathlessly. Inspector, we found the porter. Lestrade sprang forward. Alive? Yes, sir. But injured. Where? In the alley behind Drury Lane Theatre. Within minutes we were racing through midnight streets in a police carriage while Holmes sat rigidly silent beside me. Rain had begun to fall. a thin, freezing drizzle which transformed the London fog into greasy curtains of moisture clinging to every surface. Drury Lane appeared nearly deserted when we arrived, save for a cluster of policemen surrounding the mouth of a narrow alley. Arthur Hale lay inside a nearby apothecary shop where a surgeon bent over him. The young porter was pale as wax and barely conscious. Blood stained the collar of his coat. "He was stabbed?" asked Lestrade sharply. The surgeon nodded. "Shallow wound beneath the ribs, lucky angle. Another inch and he'd be dead." Holmes moved immediately beside the injured man. "Hale." The porter's eyelids fluttered weakly. "You're safe now," Holmes said quietly. "Who attacked you?" The man swallowed painfully. I didn't see. Think carefully. He came from behind. Why were you in Drury Lane?" Hale's breathing quickened nervously. "I was told to wait there." "By whom?" No answer. Holmes leaned closer. "You accepted money tonight." The porter's eyes widened faintly. "Yes." "For what?" "To keep quiet." "About what?" The young man trembled visibly. "The woman." Holmes's voice became softer still. "You knew her?" "No." "Then what did you know?" Hale closed his eyes. "She came before sunset." Lestrade stepped forward eagerly. "You saw her enter the hotel?" "Yes." "Alone?" A pause. Then, "No." Holmes's gaze sharpened like a knife. "With whom?" The porter licked dry lips. "A gentleman." "What gentleman?" "I never saw his face proper. He wore a dark coat and scarf." "Tall?" "Yes." "Anything distinctive?" He smelled. Hale frowned weakly. "Strange." Holmes glanced at me instantly. "Cigar," said I. "Precisely." The porter nodded faintly. "Yes, strong cigars," Holmes continued rapidly. "What happened then?" "They went upstairs together." "To room 47? "Yes." "And later?" "About half an hour after, the gentleman came down alone." Lestrade slammed a fist into his palm. "There we have him." But Holmes remained motionless. "You are certain he came down alone?" "Yes." "No woman accompanied him?" "No." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Did you see him leave the hotel?" Hale hesitated. "No." A long silence followed. "Interesting," murmured Holmes. Lestrade groaned. "Not that word again." Holmes ignored him. "What happened after?" "The gentleman gave me £50. The money found in your drawer." "Yes." "What did he say?" Hale swallowed painfully. "He said if anyone asked. I never saw the woman. And then I got frightened. After the police came, I thought maybe I should tell someone." "Whom?" "I wrote a note to Scotland Yard." Lestrade looked startled. "You wrote us?" Hale nodded weakly. "But before I could send it, someone grabbed me outside." "Did you recognize him?" "No." Holmes leaned closer still. "Arthur Hale, this is extremely important. When the gentleman came downstairs alone, did he carry anything?" The porter frowned in concentration. Then suddenly his eyes widened. "Yes." "What?" "A long black case." Holmes went utterly still. "What sort of case?" "Like." Hale struggled weakly. "Like musicians carry." Holmes rose slowly. Every trace of warmth had vanished from his expression. "Watson," said he quietly, "the coat stand was never a coat stand." Lestrade stared blankly. "What the devil are you talking about?" Holmes turned toward the rain-streaked window, where London's gaslights glimmered through fog like distant dying stars. "The murderer," he said softly, "transported death into that room disguised as something perfectly ordinary." And for the first time since the case began, I felt the distinct and dreadful sensation that Sherlock Holmes had glimpsed not merely the method of the crime, but the terrifying intelligence behind it. Chapter 4. The violin case. Toward 3 o'clock in the morning, Holmes and I returned at last to Baker Street, leaving Lestrade to pursue several immediate inquiries regarding the unknown gentleman described by the porter. The rain had ceased, though the fog remained thick enough that the lamps along Marylebone Road floated like pale moons in a sea of yellow smoke. Holmes had spoken scarcely a dozen words during the journey home. Such silences in him were never idle. They indicated not fatigue, but furious internal activity. More than once I observed his fingers moving faintly upon his knee, as though arranging invisible objects into orderly relation. At Baker Street, he cast aside coat and gloves with unusual abruptness. "Coffee, Watson." Mrs. Hudson, though long accustomed to our irregular hours, appeared deeply alarmed when she answered the bell in her dressing gown. "Another murder, Mr. Holmes?" "Not yet," said Holmes. The answer chilled me more than if he had replied affirmatively. Within minutes we sat once more before our familiar fire, while Holmes spread papers across the table with restless precision. "You believe another crime imminent?" I asked. Holmes filled his pipe methodically. "I believe the murderer has not completed his purpose." "You said earlier the dead woman may not have been the intended victim." "Correct." "Then who was?" "That," said Holmes, "is the central question upon which everything now depends." He lit the pipe and leaned back amidst curling blue smoke. "Let us review our facts, Watson. State them plainly." I complied as best I could. A woman arrives at the Ashburton Hotel before sunset, accompanied by a tall gentleman. She enters room 47. At some point afterward, she is murdered. Continue. The gentleman leaves carrying a long black case resembling one used for a violin or instrument. Excellent. The room is locked from within, despite the murderer's apparent departure. Holmes nodded. And a threatening message is written upon the wall. "Not threatening," Holmes corrected sharply. "Explanatory," I considered. "Then perhaps intended to mislead police." "Partially. Continue." The porter receives money to remain silent, but later attempts to inform Scotland Yard. Before he can do so, someone attacks him. Holmes closed his eyes briefly. Very good indeed. Yet the method remains impossible. At that he opened his eyes again and smiled faintly. "No, my dear Watson. Merely ingenious." He rose abruptly and crossed toward the violin lying upon the chair beside the fire. "You recall Hale's description of the object, a violin case." Holmes lifted the instrument delicately. "A violin case possesses several useful qualities. For murder, for concealment." He opened the case slowly. Inside lay the velvet-lined interior designed to cradle the violin and bow. Holmes removed the instrument entirely. "Observe the dimensions carefully." I frowned. "You think the murder weapon fit inside?" "I think something far more elaborate fit inside." He turned the empty case toward me. "Suppose one wished to transport a long metal apparatus into a hotel without attracting notice. What better disguise than the ordinary possession of a musician?" The idea struck me instantly. The missing coat stand. Precisely. Holmes shut the case with a snap. The chambermaid observed a tall object standing in room 46 earlier that day. Later it vanished. Hale observes the suspect departing with a long black case. "You think the apparatus was hidden inside?" "I am nearly certain of it. But for what purpose?" Holmes returned to the table and rapidly sketched several lines upon paper. The puncture in the ceiling, the wire inside the chimney, the removed stand, all indicate preparation rather than improvisation. He handed me the sketch. It represented the crude outline of room 47. "I believe," Holmes continued, "that the murderer constructed a mechanism within the room itself. A mechanism to kill, possibly, or perhaps to escape the appearance of presence." I shook my head. "You are speaking in riddles." "Because the final piece remains absent." At that moment he suddenly bent toward the dead woman's photograph again. For nearly a minute he studied it without speaking. Then softly, "The hands. What about them?" "They are wrong." I leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Holmes passed me the photograph. "Look carefully." The woman's hands rested loosely against her gown. At first glance they appeared entirely natural. Then I noticed it. She's holding something. Exactly. Between two fingers of her left hand rested a tiny pale fragment nearly invisible in the photograph. Holmes handed me a magnifying lens. Under enlargement the object became clearer, a sliver of dark blue silk thread. "Good Lord," said I. Holmes nodded grimly. Our victim died clutching part of her killer. The realization electrified me. "Then we can identify him, perhaps." Holmes took the photograph back thoughtfully, unless, of course, the clue was intended. You think the murderer planted it? I think this adversary anticipates investigators with uncommon intelligence. He crossed suddenly toward his chemical shelf. Nevertheless, we shall examine it. Using forceps, Holmes carefully sealed the thread within a glass slide. Tomorrow morning I shall compare its fibres. You already suspect someone. No, but you suspect a profession, perhaps. At that, Holmes paused. Interesting that you should phrase it so. Well, the violin case, not the violin case alone. He turned toward me slowly. The pianist downstairs. What pianist? At the hotel lounge. The man playing the waltz. Holmes nodded. He repeated the same technical error twice within 30 seconds. I stared. You deduced murder from piano playing. No, Watson. I deduced nervousness, he resumed, pacing. A trained musician rarely repeats identical mistakes unless distracted. Distracted by what? Fear, perhaps. He stopped beside the mantelpiece. Or guilt. By 9 the following morning, Holmes had already dispatched telegrams across London and consumed precisely 1 cup of coffee and 7 cigarettes. A ratio which generally indicated severe mental exertion. Lestrade arrived shortly thereafter, looking exhausted and irritable. Well? Asked Holmes immediately. No identification yet on the woman. The gentleman? Nothing definite, but we traced the cigars. Holmes's eyes sharpened. Yes, imported Turkish blend sold only by 3 tobacconists in London. Excellent. 1 customer bought them regularly over the past month. Holmes leaned forward. Name? Lestrade hesitated dramatically. Adrian Vane. Holmes repeated the name softly. Vane. You know him? Only by reputation. Who is he? I asked. Lestrade snorted. A society musician. Violinist. Performs at aristocratic gatherings and private clubs. Holmes smiled very slightly. How obliging. But there's more, Lestrade continued. Vane performed last night at the Ashburton Hotel lounge. I sat upright. The pianist, exactly. Holmes's expression, however, remained strangely reserved. You arrested him? No. He vanished after midnight. Holmes sighed softly. That complicates matters. Lestrade blinked. Complicates? We have motive, opportunity, the cigars, and likely the violin case besides. Too neat, said Holmes. Oh, not again. Holmes ignored the protest. My dear Lestrade, when evidence aligns with such theatrical precision, one must immediately suspect arrangement. You think he's innocent? I think someone wishes us to think him guilty. Lestrade threw up his hands. You contradict yourself at every turn, only because the facts themselves contradict. Holmes took up his hat abruptly. We shall visit Adrian Vane's residence. An hour later we arrived in Kensington, before a narrow but elegant townhouse overlooking a rain-darkened square. The servant who answered the door appeared badly frightened. Mr. Vane has not returned, sir. When was he last seen? Holmes asked. Yesterday afternoon. Anyone visit him recently? The servant hesitated. A lady came 2 nights ago. What lady? I do not know her name. Holmes showed the photograph of the dead woman. The servant recoiled visibly. That's her, Lestrade smiled triumphantly. There now. But Holmes merely nodded thoughtfully. Did you overhear conversation? No, sir. Only shouting. Shouting? Yes, sir. The woman sounded angry. About what? I couldn't hear properly. Holmes entered the house without further ceremony. Vane's study occupied the rear of the ground floor. A richly furnished chamber crowded with sheet music, violins, and framed concert programs. Holmes examined the room with intense concentration. Then suddenly he crossed to the fireplace. Ha! What now? Asked Lestrade. Holmes held up a scrap of partially burned paper remarkably similar to the fragment recovered from room 47. Upon it remained visible only 2 printed letters. Another message? I asked. No. Holmes narrowed his eyes. A theatre ticket. He turned sharply toward the servant. Did your master attend the theatre often? Yes, sir. Drury Lane mostly. Lestrade looked startled. The same place where the porter was found. Precisely. Holmes moved swiftly toward the desk. Among scattered correspondence lay a folded concert advertisement. He scanned it rapidly. Then his expression changed. Watson. Yes. Observe the date. I did so. The performance advertised had occurred exactly 1 week earlier at a charitable musical exhibition held at the Ashburton Grand Hotel. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Our dead woman knew Adrian Vane before yesterday. Lestrade folded his arms smugly. So he lied, undoubtedly. Then he killed her. Holmes looked toward the window thoughtfully. No. No, Adrian Vane, said Holmes softly, is not behaving like a murderer. Then what is he doing? Holmes slipped the advertisement into his pocket. He is behaving like a man who is terrified. And scarcely had he uttered those words when the front doorbell rang violently downstairs. A moment later, hurried footsteps approached. The servant appeared pale as death. There's a gentleman asking for the police. Lestrade straightened instantly. Who is he? The servant swallowed hard. He says, mister, Vane has been found. Silence filled the room. Where? Asked Holmes quietly. The servant's lips trembled. In the river, sir. Chapter V. The Musician in the Thames. Within half an hour we stood upon the fog-laden embankment near Blackfriars Bridge, while grey morning light struggled weakly through the clouds above London. A bitter wind swept from the Thames, carrying with it the foul mingled odours of coal smoke, wet stone, and river mud. Policemen held back a small gathering of dock workers and curious passers-by, whose murmured speculation drifted through the mist like the buzzing of flies. Holmes moved through them with long, decisive strides. Near the water's edge, partially sheltered beneath an archway, lay the body of Adrian Vane. At least, so it first appeared. Lestrade knelt beside the figure, while a police surgeon adjusted his spectacles grimly. Dead? Asked Holmes. No, said the surgeon. Unconscious from exposure and head trauma. Holmes's eyes flashed briefly. Excellent. The supposed corpse lay wrapped in a blanket, his dark hair soaked through with river water. A bruise discoloured one temple, while his breathing came in shallow, uneven motions. Even in that state there remained about the man an undeniable refinement. His hands were slender and delicate, the hands of an artist rather than a labourer. Holmes bent immediately over them. "What are you looking for now?" muttered Lestrade. "Calluses. Well, there are none." The inspector frowned. "And that matters because a professional violinist develops pressure marks upon the left fingertips and beneath the jaw." He lifted Vane's hand slightly. "This man possesses neither." Lestrade blinked. "You mean he's not Adrian Vane?" "Oh, he is Adrian Vane," Holmes replied calmly, "but not a violinist." The inspector stared as though uncertain whether Holmes had lost his senses entirely. "We found sheet music in his house. One may own telescopes without being an astronomer." Holmes examined the unconscious man more closely. "Notice the wrists." Faint red indentations circled both. "He was tied," said I. "Precisely." Lestrade scratched irritably at his collar. "Very well. Someone attacks him, binds him, and throws him into the river." "No." Holmes pointed toward the coat. "Dry beneath the lapels." I looked carefully and saw that he was correct. The man entered the water already unconscious. Lestrade groaned. "You derive an encyclopedia from a damp coat?" Holmes ignored him entirely. "What time was he discovered?" "A barge worker spotted him around dawn," said the surgeon. "Caught among pilings below the bridge." Holmes rose slowly. Then our adversary grows desperate. "You still think Vane innocent?" demanded Lestrade. "I think," Holmes answered, "that someone wishes him silenced without killing him." The inspector frowned. "That makes no sense." "It will." Holmes turned abruptly toward the nearest constable. "Did the victim carry anything?" "Only this, sir." The constable produced a water-stained leather wallet. Inside were several banknotes, visiting cards, and a folded paper which Holmes opened carefully. At once his expression sharpened. "What is it?" I asked. Holmes handed me the paper. It was a railway receipt for luggage storage at Charing Cross Station. The item deposited was described only as one black instrument case. Lestrade gave a triumphant exclamation. There's your violin case. Yes, said Holmes quietly. And perhaps our mechanism besides. He folded the receipt carefully into his pocket. Come, Watson, we are going to Charing Cross immediately. But what about Vane? Holmes glanced once more toward the unconscious man. He will recover. You sound certain. I am. How can you know? Holmes's gaze hardened. Because the person behind these crimes kills only when necessary. The journey through London proved slow, owing to the heavy traffic of morning omnibuses and delivery wagons clogging the streets. Holmes remained silent throughout, his gaunt profile rigid with concentration. At last we arrived at Charing Cross Station amid clouds of steam and the metallic thunder of departing trains. Holmes moved rapidly toward the luggage office and presented the receipt. The attendant, a sleepy clerk with sandy whiskers, examined it briefly. "One moment, sir." He disappeared into the storage room beyond. Moments later he returned carrying a long black case, exactly as described. Holmes accepted it with almost reverential care. "Do not open it here," he murmured. Lestrade looked ready to burst from impatience. "For heaven's sake, Holmes." "Not here." His tone admitted no argument. We hired a private room inside the station hotel, where Holmes laid the case carefully upon a table. It was larger than an ordinary violin case, though similarly shaped. Black leather. Brass clasps. No initials. Holmes examined the exterior minutely. "No scratches," he observed softly. "Recently purchased." Then he opened it. I confess I recoiled involuntarily. Inside lay no violin. Instead, the velvet-lined interior contained an arrangement of polished metal rods, wires, hooks, pulleys, and collapsible segments of brass tubing fitted together with astonishing precision. Lestrade stared open-mouthed. "What in God's name is that?" Holmes lifted one section delicately. "A mechanical framework." "For what purpose?" Without answering, Holmes began assembling the pieces with swift practiced movements. The structure gradually lengthened into a narrow articulated pole, nearly 7 feet high. At its upper end projected a hooked metal arm attached to wire. My blood ran cold. "The ceiling puncture," I whispered. "Exactly." Holmes continued assembling. Within minutes the purpose became horrifyingly clear. The device could extend upward toward a ceiling, while controlled remotely through tension wire threaded downward along its shaft. Lestrade gaped. "You mean the murderer operated something overhead?" Holmes nodded slowly. The entire locked room illusion depended upon vertical movement. "But movement of what?" Holmes pointed toward a slender steel spike concealed among the apparatus. "A weapon." The inspector swore softly. "Then the victim was stabbed from above?" "No," said Holmes. "Then what the devil?" Holmes suddenly stopped. His gaze had fixed upon something hidden inside the case lining. A folded scrap of paper. He removed it carefully. For several moments he read in silence. Then, very quietly, "Ah, what is it?" I demanded. Holmes handed me the paper. It appeared to be part of a handwritten letter. Only a fragment remained. "If she speaks to the police, everything collapses. Room 47 must remain sealed until morning." The signature was missing. Lestrade seized the note eagerly. "There! Proof!" "Proof of what?" asked Holmes mildly. "That someone planned the crime." "Yes, and knew the woman, obviously, and feared exposure." Holmes sat down slowly. "My dear Lestrade, the obvious is very often the least trustworthy element in any investigation." The inspector groaned aloud. Holmes ignored him. Instead, he studied the mechanical apparatus again with renewed intensity. At last he spoke. "This device was not constructed by an amateur. You think an engineer made it?" "No." "Then who?" Holmes tapped thoughtfully at one brass joint. "A stage illusionist, perhaps, or someone familiar with theatrical machinery." "The theatre ticket," said I suddenly. Holmes smiled faintly. "Excellent, Watson." Lestrade frowned. "You think the murderer works in theatre?" "I think our investigation and Drury Lane are connected far more deeply than coincidence permits." He folded the letter fragment carefully away. "But there remains one fatal inconsistency." What inconsistency? I asked. Holmes rose and walked slowly toward the window overlooking the station yard below. The mechanism explains the illusion. Yes, but not the message upon the wall. Lestrade snorted. That was written by the killer. No. Holmes turned. It was written by the victim. Silence struck the room like a blow. What? I exclaimed. Holmes nodded calmly. The woman wrote it herself shortly before death. That's impossible, said Lestrade. You said the writing imitated a right-handed man. Exactly. The inspector stared blankly. Holmes continued. She was attempting to disguise her own hand. But why? Holmes's expression darkened. Because she wished us to believe someone else remained alive after she died. I felt a chill crawl slowly along my spine. You mean? She expected to be murdered? I believe, said Holmes quietly, that she knew precisely what was about to happen in room 47. Before another word could be spoken, hurried knocking rattled the hotel door. A railway messenger entered carrying a telegram. For Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Holmes tore it open. As he read, every trace of colour seemed to drain from his lean face. I had witnessed many extraordinary reactions in Holmes over the years. Surprise, triumph, fury, but never pure shock. What is it? I asked sharply. He handed me the telegram without a word. It read, Arthur Hale dead in hospital. Bed at 11:20. Stop no witnesses. Stop doctor reports. Strangulation. Stop. Lestrade uttered an oath. But Holmes said nothing. He merely stood motionless beside the window, while steam from departing locomotives drifted upward beyond the glass, like ghosts rising from the earth. At length he spoke in a voice so quiet I scarcely heard it. We are dealing, said Sherlock Holmes, with a man who murders even the dying to preserve silence. Chapter 6. The Silent Witness. If the murder of the unknown woman in room 47 had struck London, society with alarm, the death of Arthur Hale transformed alarm into outright panic. By noon the newspapers had seized upon the affair with savage enthusiasm. Mystery of the locked hotel. Room. Second victim. Slain Scotland Yard baffled newsboys shouted the headlines along every crowded thoroughfare, while cafes and gentlemen's clubs hummed with speculation. The public imagination, once captured by mystery, is a force both insatiable and merciless. Holmes, however, cared nothing for public hysteria. What matters, said he as we rode once more toward the Ashburton Hotel, is not what the newspapers print, but what the murderer reads. You think he follows the reports? I am certain of it. Why? Because vanity is inseparable from intellectual crime. Holmes spoke with unusual severity that afternoon. Arthur Hale's death had affected him more deeply than he cared to admit. Indeed, despite the common belief that Sherlock Holmes possessed no human sympathies, I had long observed that needless cruelty roused in him a cold and terrible anger unlike any ordinary emotion. He could tolerate evil more readily than stupidity, but cowardice never. He killed Hale because the man was frightened, Holmes murmured. That alone tells us much. How so? A murderer acting from panic kills recklessly. This one kills surgically. You believe the hospital murder planned in advance? Without question. The cab stopped before the Ashburton, where constables now guarded the entrance and clusters of curious citizens lingered across the street despite the drizzle. Inside, the atmosphere had become nearly unbearable. Servants whispered behind half-open doors. Guests moved quickly through corridors with lowered voices and anxious glances. Even the electric lights seemed somehow dimmer beneath the oppressive mood hanging over the building. Lestrade awaited us in the lobby, looking more exhausted than ever. The hospital's sealed, said he immediately. No one entered or left the ward according to staff. Holmes removed his gloves calmly. Then someone already inside committed the murder. That's what I said. And naturally no one listened. Lestrade grunted sourly. Holmes continued. The strangulation? With a cord. Description? Thin silk. Holmes stopped walking. Colour? Dark blue. A silence fell. I looked sharply toward Holmes. The thread, I whispered. Precisely. Lestrade frowned. What thread? Holmes withdrew the tiny silk fragment recovered from the dead woman's fingers. The inspector's eyes widened. Same material, almost certainly. Then Hale struggled with the killer. No, Holmes replied softly. The woman did. He slipped the fragment away once more. Has anything in room 47 been disturbed? Nothing. Good. I require absolute privacy there. Lestrade sighed. You and your damned rooms. But he led us upstairs at once. The corridor outside room 47 stood deserted, save for one constable stationed nearby. Holmes entered immediately and locked the door behind us. The room appeared unchanged since our previous visit, though daylight filtering through the heavy curtains lent the chamber an even more melancholy aspect. Holmes walked directly toward the wall bearing the message. She opened the door herself. For several moments he studied it in silence. Then unexpectedly he took from his pocket a measuring tape and began calculating the exact height of the letters from the floor. "What are you about now?" asked Lestrade. "Verifying posture." "What posture?" "The writer's." He completed the measurements carefully. Then he crossed toward the chaise beside the corpse. At once his eyes narrowed. "Ah, what now?" Holmes pointed toward the carpet. Near the edge of the chaise appeared several faint indentations scarcely visible except in direct light. Circular marks. Lestrade crouched beside them. "Furniture stood here." "Yes," said Holmes. "The missing coat stand?" "No." Holmes smiled slightly. "A chair?" The inspector stared. "Well, naturally, there was a chair." "Not originally," Holmes measured the distance thoughtfully. "Someone moved it beside the victim shortly before death." "Why?" "To reach the wall." I looked sharply toward the message. "You mean she wrote it while standing on the chair?" "Exactly." Lestrade blinked. "But if she wrote the message herself?" "She required height to disguise the angle of penmanship." Holmes turned toward us. The woman was significantly shorter than the supposed male author implied by the lettering. For several seconds, even Lestrade appeared genuinely impressed. Then his brow furrowed again. But why would she do that? Holmes's expression darkened. Because she believed someone else would survive. A curious tension had entered his voice. "You mean she expected the murderer to escape?" "No." Holmes looked slowly around the room. "I mean she expected someone else to die here." The words struck us both silent. Holmes moved suddenly toward the fireplace again. "You observed the coal soot beneath her fingernails?" "Yes." "Yet there exists remarkably little soot upon the hearth itself." I frowned. "You think she reached into the chimney?" "She attempted to." Holmes inserted his hand carefully upward inside the flue. A moment later he withdrew a tiny object wrapped in ash-blackened cloth. Lestrade gave a low whistle. "Well done." Holmes unfolded the cloth. Inside lay a woman's gold locket. He opened it carefully. Within was a miniature photograph of the dead woman herself beside another figure, partially obscured by damage. Only the shoulder and collar of a man remained visible. Dark blue silk, the same material again. Holmes examined the locket intensely. Then suddenly his expression sharpened. "Watson?" "Yes, look at the collar." I did so. A tiny embroidered symbol appeared upon the edge of the fabric, a silver lyre. "Theatrical costume?" I suggested. Holmes nodded slowly. "Or orchestra uniform." Lestrade folded his arms triumphantly. "So our musician again." "Perhaps." But Holmes no longer sounded convinced. Instead he crossed toward the window with restless energy. "No. No. Something remains wrong." "What now?" asked Lestrade irritably. Holmes pointed toward the corpse. "Everything about this scene suggests preparation." "Well, obviously. The disguised message, the hidden locket, even the soot. You think she planted clues?" "I think," Holmes said slowly, "she feared being forgotten." A curious sadness entered his face then, brief but unmistakable. Before I could remark upon it, there came sudden knocking at the door. A constable entered hurriedly. "Message for Inspector Lestrade." The inspector read the note quickly. "Well now," said he, "that's interesting." Holmes extended his hand impatiently. Lestrade passed him the paper. It contained only a brief report. Inquiry at St. Bartholomew's confirms dead woman recently visited hospital under false name requesting information regarding poison symptoms. Holmes went very still. Poison, he murmured. What does that mean? I asked. Instead of replying, Holmes approached the body once more and knelt beside it with renewed intensity. He examined the woman's lips, eyes, fingertips, then abruptly. Dr. Renwick's conclusion was incomplete. Lestrade frowned. You think she wasn't stabbed? She was. Then what? Holmes rose slowly. The puncture wound killed her. Instantly. Yes. But something else frightened her, long before the blade ever touched her. He looked toward the untouched wineglass resting upon the table near the window. Has anyone analysed that? No, said Lestrade. Holmes lifted the glass delicately toward the light. Only a thin amber residue remained within. He sniffed it once. Then his entire expression changed. Good God! What is it? I demanded. Holmes handed me the glass. A faint, bitter odour lingered at the bottom. Medicinal. Sharp. I recognised it instantly from my medical practice. Laudanum. Exactly. Lestrade stared. She was drugged? Holmes nodded grimly. Not enough to kill. Only enough to weaken. Then the murderer poisoned her first and stabbed her after. No. Holmes's eyes drifted once more toward the message on the wall. She took the laudanum voluntarily. Silence. You're certain? I asked. Yes. How can you know? Because, said Holmes quietly. The dosage was carefully measured. A terrible possibility entered my mind. You think she expected to die. I think she feared what would happen before death. The room fell silent save for the muffled sounds of distant hotel activity below. Then Holmes crossed suddenly toward the wardrobe. Until that moment it had attracted little attention. The doors stood partially open, revealing hanging garments and empty shelves within. Holmes examined the interior carefully. Then he crouched. What now? Lestrade groaned. Holmes pointed toward the floorboards inside the wardrobe. A faint trail of white powder extended into darkness at the rear. He touched it lightly. Chalk. The same mud from her dress, I said. Precisely. Holmes's face tightened. Without warning, he seized a candle from the mantelpiece and crawled fully into the wardrobe. Holmes! I exclaimed. No answer. For several moments only silence came from within. Then suddenly his voice emerged, sharp and utterly transformed. Lestrade. Yes? Send immediately for every architectural plan of this hotel. Why? Holmes crawled backwards slowly from the wardrobe, his eyes blazing with fierce excitement. Because room 47, said he, was never truly empty. Chapter 7. The Hidden Chamber. There are moments in every great investigation when scattered fragments suddenly begin to gather into dreadful coherence. One does not yet perceive the whole truth, but its outline emerges dimly through confusion like a shape materializing within fog. Such a moment had now arrived. Holmes stood motionless beside the wardrobe. In room 47, his face sharpened by that fierce inward excitement which always signalled some tremendous intellectual advance. Lestrade stared at him blankly. What do you mean the room wasn't empty? Holmes brushed chalk dust from his sleeve. I mean precisely what I say. There's nowhere to hide in here, so one would naturally conclude. Lestrade threw up his hands. You've inspected every inch yourself. Indeed, yet one may examine a thing thoroughly, and still misunderstand its purpose. Holmes knelt once more before the wardrobe floorboards, and passed his fingers delicately along the rear panel. You observe this chalk residue extending inward. Yes, the woman's dress carried the same material. What of it? Holmes tapped lightly upon the wooden backing. A hollow sound answered. Lestrade froze. Well, I'll be damned. Holmes smiled faintly. At last. The inspector lunged forward immediately and hammered against the panel with his fist. There's space behind it. Approximately 3 feet, Holmes replied calmly. Possibly more. But how? Holmes rose. Architectural concealment. Very likely connected to ventilation or old service access before renovation. Then, someone hid behind the wardrobe. Someone occupied the space during the murder. The implication struck me with chilling force. You mean the killer never left the room at all? On the contrary, Holmes replied. He left it quite efficiently afterward. Lestrade was already shouting for constables. Within minutes, tools had been procured from the hotel maintenance staff. Under Holmes's direction, the rear wardrobe panel was pried loose carefully from its frame. A narrow concealed compartment emerged beyond, dusty, dark, and unmistakably man-made. A stale current of cold air drifted outward, carrying the odours of old plaster and coal smoke. Holmes took the candle and entered, first. I followed close behind, while Lestrade muttered nervous curses and squeezed after us. The hidden cavity proved larger than expected. An enclosed maintenance corridor running between walls and extending several yards along the building interior. Electrical conduits and ancient piping lined the cramped passage. More importantly, footprints marked the dust. Fresh footprints. Holmes crouched instantly beside them. Rubber soles. "Can you identify them?" asked Lestrade. "Not yet." He advanced farther. The passage eventually terminated at a narrow iron ladder leading upward into darkness. Holmes lifted the candle. The attic storage rooms. Lestrade gave a low whistle. So the murderer hid here waiting. Most likely, and escaped upward afterward. Yes, but then why the locked door trick? Holmes's eyes gleamed. To delay discovery. He climbed the ladder swiftly. We emerged several moments later into a vast, dim attic, crowded with crates, broken furnishings, and disused hotel equipment draped beneath dusty sheets. Rain tapped softly overhead against slate roofing. Holmes surveyed the place rapidly. Then he moved toward the far wall. Here. A small trapdoor stood partially concealed behind stacked trunks. Beyond it lay a secondary stair, descending toward the rear service entrance of the hotel. Lestrade slapped his thigh triumphantly. That's it then. Holmes remained thoughtful, partially. You still aren't satisfied? The mechanism explains movement, not motive. The inspector groaned. Motive? We have enough evidence to hang 3 men already. Holmes turned sharply. And yet we still do not know why the woman willingly entered room 47. That silenced even Lestrade. For indeed the question had begun to haunt us all. The dead woman had anticipated danger. She had disguised her own writing, taken laudanum voluntarily, hidden clues before death, and apparently cooperated, at least initially, with the elaborate arrangements surrounding her murder. Why? Holmes descended once more into room 47 and stood gazing thoughtfully at the corpse. You knew him, he murmured softly. Enough to fear him, yet enough to trust him also. Lestrade folded his arms. A blackmailer, perhaps. No, a lover? Closer. Holmes bent suddenly over the woman's left wrist. What's this? I stepped nearer. Faint discoloration marked the skin just below the glove line, almost circular. An old bruise, said I. No, Holmes replied quietly. An old burn. He examined it carefully through his lens. Then unexpectedly he smiled. Excellent. What now? Asked Lestrade. Our victim belonged to the theatre. The orchestra? Not musician, Holmes corrected. Stage performer. How can you tell? Holmes indicated the mark. Rope burn. The inspector stared blankly. Acrobatic apparatus, Holmes explained. Common among aerial performers. The idea electrified me instantly. The mechanical device, I exclaimed. The hidden corridor. The stagecraft. Exactly, Watson. Holmes paced slowly. We have been thinking too narrowly. This entire crime was constructed theatrically. Lestrade frowned. You mean by an actor? Possibly. Or someone accustomed to illusion, timing, and controlled spectacle. He stopped suddenly. The Drury Lane connection becomes essential. Before another word could be spoken, hurried footsteps sounded in the corridor outside. A constable appeared at the doorway. Inspector, the hotel manager says 2 gentlemen from the theatre are downstairs asking about Mr. Adrian Vane. Holmes's eyes flashed instantly. Show them up. Moments later the visitors entered. The first was a stout middle-aged man with theatrical side whiskers and anxious eyes. The second, younger and elegantly dressed, carried himself with nervous refinement. The older man introduced himself immediately. Bernard Kessler, stage manager at Drury Lane Theatre. Holmes bowed slightly. And your companion? Mr. Julian Merrick. At the name, Holmes's gaze sharpened almost imperceptibly. Merrick? Said he softly. Yes, answered the younger man. Assistant conductor. Holmes motioned them inward. You knew Adrian Vane? Kessler snorted heavily. Knew him? Man was no violinist at all. Lestrade blinked. You too. Could barely hold a bow proper, said Kessler, though he dressed the part well enough. Holmes leaned forward slightly. Then, what was his true employment? The two theatre men exchanged uneasy glances. At last Merrick spoke quietly. He arranged private introductions. Silence followed. Holmes nodded once. I see, Lestrade frowned. You'd better explain for the rest of us. Kessler cleared his throat awkwardly. Certain wealthy gentlemen attending performances desired acquaintance with actresses. Dancers, performers. A procurer, said Holmes coldly. Merrick looked uncomfortable. He called himself an agent. And the dead woman? Holmes asked. The younger man hesitated visibly. I believe her name was Clara Marlowe. Holmes repeated it softly. Clara Marlowe. She performed aerial routines at Drury Lane until 6 months ago. Why did she leave? Neither man answered immediately. Holmes's voice hardened. Why? Kessler wiped his brow. There was an accident. What sort of accident? A fall during rehearsal. She survived. Yes, but another performer died. A strange stillness entered Holmes's face. What performer? Merrick swallowed. A young woman named Elise Vernet. At that name, something changed instantly in Holmes's expression. Very slight, yet unmistakable. You recognize it, I said. Holmes looked slowly toward me. Yes. From where? Instead of answering directly, he turned toward Merrick. Miss Vernet was French. Yes, and engaged to someone connected with the theatre. The assistant conductor stared. How did you know? Holmes's eyes narrowed. Because I have finally begun to understand room 47. Lestrade exploded impatiently. For heaven's sake, Holmes, stop speaking in riddles. But Holmes was no longer listening. He had crossed abruptly toward the fireplace again. Then to the hidden passage, then back toward the corpse. His movements quickened visibly. At last he stopped dead center within the room. My God. What is it? I demanded. Holmes looked genuinely shaken. The victim in room 47 was never the intended target. You said that before. No, he replied quietly. I understand it now. A terrible silence followed. Holmes turned slowly toward us. Clara Marlowe came here expecting to save someone. Save whom? Holmes's eyes drifted toward the hidden corridor. The person waiting inside the walls. The implications struck like ice water. You mean, I began. Yes. Holmes spoke very softly now. There were 2 intended victims in room 47. At that precise instant, from somewhere below in the hotel lobby, a woman screamed. Chapter 8. The woman in grey gloves. The scream echoed upward through the hotel with such force and terror that every soul upon the 4th floor froze instinctively where they stood. Then chaos erupted. Lestrade sprang toward the corridor while constables thundered past us down the staircase, 2 steps at a time. Hotel guests emerged from rooms in alarm, their voices blending into a confused storm of questions and panic. Holmes alone remained perfectly still for one fractional moment, listening, his head tilted slightly. Then suddenly he moved with explosive speed. Not the lobby, he snapped. What? Cried Lestrade from halfway down the hall. The scream came from the west stairwell. Without another word, Holmes dashed in the opposite direction. I followed immediately. The west corridor lay dimmer than the main passage, illuminated only by intermittent gas brackets, whose uncertain glow threw long shadows across the carpet runner. Ahead of us, a maid stood pressed against the wall, trembling violently. Holmes seized her shoulders. What happened? She collapsed, sir. Who? A lady? Where? The maid pointed toward the stairwell landing. We rounded the corner at once. A woman lay unconscious beside the iron banister. She appeared perhaps 35 years of age, richly dressed in dark travelling clothes, with a feathered hat fallen beside her upon the floor. One grey glove remained upon her left hand, while the other lay several feet away as though torn off in struggle. Holmes dropped instantly beside her. "Alive," said he. Lestrade arrived moments later, flushed and breathless. "Well, she fainted. From fright? Possibly." Holmes lifted the fallen glove delicately. Then his eyes sharpened. "Interesting." "What now?" groaned Lestrade. Holmes turned the glove inside out. Stitched into the lining appeared a tiny embroidered mark, a silver lyre, exactly matching the symbol upon the fragmentary costume collar inside Clara Marlowe's locket. Holmes's expression darkened immediately. "She belongs to the theatre." The unconscious woman stirred faintly. Her eyes fluttered open. For an instant she seemed disoriented. Then she saw Holmes. Absolute terror flooded her features. "No," she gasped. "Keep him away." Holmes's voice became unexpectedly gentle. "Madam, you are safe." "No, no one is safe." She attempted to rise but nearly collapsed again. Holmes steadied her carefully. "What is your name?" The woman hesitated. Then quietly, "Vivienne LaSalle." At the name Holmes exchanged the briefest glance with me. French again. "You knew Clara Marlowe?" he asked. The woman's face turned deathly pale. "Where is she?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, "You came here looking for her?" "Yes." "Why?" Her breathing quickened visibly. "I received a letter." "From Clara?" "No." "Then from whom?" The woman clutched suddenly at Holmes's sleeve with desperate force. "You must listen carefully, Mr. Holmes." Lestrade blinked. "You know who he is?" "Everyone in London knows who he is," she whispered. Holmes leaned closer. "What does the letter say?" Vivienne reached tremblingly into her handbag and produced a folded sheet. Holmes opened it. As his eyes scanned the contents, I observed an extraordinary transformation pass over his face. Not surprise, recognition. "What is it?" I demanded. Holmes handed me the paper. The message was brief. "Come to the Asperton if you wish to learn why Elise Vernet died. Room 47, come alone, no signature." I looked sharply toward Holmes. Elise again. Precisely. Lestrade folded his arms. "So this all comes back to the theatre accident." Holmes remained thoughtful. "Perhaps." Vivienne LaSalle suddenly seized Holmes's wrist again. "You don't understand," she whispered. "He said it would begin again." "Who said?" Her eyes darted fearfully toward the staircase shadows. "I never saw his face." Holmes's voice lowered. "But you know who he means." The woman swallowed painfully. "Yes, tell me." She hesitated so long that I feared she might refuse entirely. Then at last, "The man in grey gloves." A silence followed. Lestrade frowned. "What man?" Vivienne pressed trembling fingers against her temples. "He used to watch rehearsals from the upper balcony. Always alone. Always wearing grey gloves. Did anyone know him?" "No." "He spoke to Clara?" "Yes." "When?" "After Elise died." Holmes's eyes sharpened instantly. Elise Vernet's death was not accidental. Vivienne looked at him with visible shock. "You know?" "No," said Holmes quietly. "But you do." The woman closed her eyes. For several moments she seemed to struggle internally against fear itself. Then slowly she nodded. "My God," murmured Holmes. Lestrade stepped forward impatiently. "Enough of this. If there was murder before, why wasn't police informed?" Vivienne laughed bitterly. "Because no one could prove anything." Holmes's tone became razor sharp. "Tell me exactly what happened." The woman drew a shaky breath. Elise performed aerial suspension work above the stage. During rehearsal, one of the support cables snapped. "And Clara?" "She survived, because Elise pushed her clear before falling." Holmes went very still. "The rope burn upon Clara's wrist." Vivienne nodded weakly. "She tried to hold Elise." "Who inspected the apparatus?" "A stage engineer named Marcus Hale." At the name Lestrade frowned. "Hale? Relation to the porter?" Vivienne looked startled. Arthur Hale was his younger brother. Holmes's face hardened instantly. "Of course." The pattern emerged all at once with dreadful clarity. Arthur Hale had recognised something connected to the theatre. The hidden mechanisms, the stagecraft, perhaps even the killer himself. And thus, Arthur Hale had died. Holmes paced slowly along the landing. Marcus Hale investigated Elise's death privately afterward. Vivian nodded. He believed the cable was cut deliberately. Did he identify the culprit? He thought he did. Who? The woman hesitated again. Then very softly, Adrian Vane. Lestrade slammed a fist against the banister. There. But Holmes shook his head immediately. No. The inspector groaned aloud. You contradict every witness alive. Holmes ignored him entirely. What became of Marcus Hale? He asked. Vivian's voice dropped nearly to a whisper. He disappeared. When? 3 months after Elise died, without explanation. Yes. Holmes's eyes narrowed, and Clara Marlowe continued investigating afterward. Vivian stared. How did you know? Because Clara came willingly to room 47. He stopped pacing. Someone promised her answers. A terrible thought struck me suddenly. The hidden compartment. Holmes turned instantly toward me. Yes. The second intended victim. Exactly. Lestrade frowned. You think someone waited inside the wall? No, Holmes answered softly. I think someone was supposed to. Before further explanation could come, hurried footsteps sounded nearby. A constable approached, carrying several architectural documents. Plans for the hotel. Sir, Holmes seized them eagerly. Within moments he had spread the blueprints across a nearby table beneath the corridor lamp. His eyes moved rapidly over the diagrams. Then suddenly he stopped. For several seconds, absolute silence reigned. At last Holmes spoke in a tone unlike any I had heard before. Cold, utterly cold. The hidden passage does not terminate in the attic. Lestrade bent over the plans. What? Holmes pointed toward a narrow line extending beyond the service corridor. There is another chamber. Where? Directly beside room 47. But we searched the walls. No, Holmes replied quietly. We searched for space, not for purpose. Vivian LaSalle stared down at the blueprint with widening horror. Oh God! Holmes looked sharply toward her. You know this room. She backed away visibly. No. Yes, you do. Her lips trembled violently. It was sealed years ago. What room? Demanded Lestrade. Holmes answered without taking his eyes from Vivienne. The old rehearsal chamber used by aerial performers before renovation. Rain rattled suddenly against the stairwell windows, as though punctuating the words. Holmes rolled up the blueprints slowly. Lestrade, I require armed men immediately. The inspector blinked. You think someone's hiding there now? Holmes met his gaze directly. No. Then why armed men? For the first time since I had known Sherlock Holmes, I saw unmistakable uncertainty pass across his features. Because, said he quietly, I no longer believe we are searching for a murderer alone. Chapter 9. The room behind the wall. No man who has not experienced it can fully understand the peculiar tension produced by advancing knowingly toward hidden danger within confined darkness. As Holmes, Lestrade, and I ascended once more toward the concealed service corridor behind room 47, I confess that even my nerves, hardened by years beside Sherlock Holmes, had begun to feel the oppressive strain of the affair. The hotel itself seemed transformed. Every creak of timber, every distant footstep, every murmur drifting upward from below acquired sinister significance. Rain lashed steadily against the windows now, while the wind moaned along the outer walls of the building like some restless, invisible presence. Holmes carried a lantern in one hand and the rolled architectural plans beneath his arm. 2 armed constables followed close behind, while Lestrade muttered occasional impatient curses beneath his breath. You truly think someone's inside this hidden room? The inspector asked quietly. Holmes did not answer at once. At length, I think someone has been inside it recently. That's not the same thing. No. We entered room 47 again. The dead woman had finally been removed to the morgue. Yet the chamber retained a strange, lingering atmosphere. as though the violence committed there still clung invisibly to the furnishings and walls. Holmes crossed directly to the wardrobe. "The concealed corridor," he said softly, "was only the first layer of deception." He removed the rear panel once more and climbed through. We followed. The narrow maintenance passage appeared even more oppressive now beneath the lantern glow. Dust swirled faintly in the cold air, while ancient pipes cast long, distorted shadows against the walls. Holmes advanced to the far end where the architectural plan indicated an adjoining structure beyond the visible boundary. "Here!" He raised the lantern. At first I perceived nothing unusual. Then slowly a seam emerged in the brickwork. A hidden door. Lestrade uttered a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned twice over." The concealed entrance blended almost perfectly into the wall itself. Only close inspection revealed the narrow outline of hinges blackened by age and soot. Holmes examined the locking mechanism carefully. "Recently opened." "How can you tell?" asked Lestrade. "Oil residue." He pointed toward faint smears near the iron latch. "Someone maintained this door." The inspector drew his revolver. "Stand back." But Holmes caught his arm instantly. "No." "What now?" "If the room beyond remains occupied, surprise is our only advantage." Lestrade scowled, but lowered the weapon reluctantly. Holmes listened carefully at the hidden door. For several moments absolute silence prevailed. Then a sound. Faint metallic, like something gently striking against glass. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "You heard it," I whispered. "Yes." Lestrade gripped his revolver again. "That settles it." Holmes nodded once. Then, very slowly, he pressed against the hidden latch. The door opened inward with a long whispering creak. Cold darkness breathed out from within. Holmes lifted the lantern higher. The chamber beyond was large, far larger than any of us anticipated. An abandoned rehearsal room, dust-covered ropes and pulleys hung from the ceiling beams. Old stage curtains lay collapsed in heaps against the walls. Rusted rigging apparatus occupied one corner, while cracked mirrors reflected fragments of lantern light in ghostly distortions, and at the centre of the room stood a chair. Occupied. The figure seated there did not move. Lestrade surged forward instantly. "Stay where you are." No response. Holmes approached slowly. The seated man stared straight ahead with fixed glassy eyes. Dead. A thin cord remained wound about his throat. I recognised him immediately from the description given earlier. Marcus Hale. Or rather what remained of him. His body had evidently occupied the chair for weeks, perhaps months. Even Lestrade recoiled slightly. "Good Lord!" Holmes remained utterly still, then softly. "So this is where he vanished." The room fell silent save for rain hammering overhead. Marcus Hale's corpse had been dressed carefully in ordinary workman's clothing, yet one detail instantly arrested Holmes's attention. Grey gloves covered both dead hands. Holmes stared at them for several seconds without speaking. Then he removed one carefully. Beneath it the fingers appeared badly scarred. Burns, chemical burns perhaps. Lestrade grimaced. "What happened to him?" Holmes examined the scars closely. Acid. Yes. Holmes's face darkened further. Deliberate disfigurement. A chill passed through me. "You think someone tortured him?" "No." Holmes looked slowly around the chamber. "I think someone erased him." Lestrade frowned. "That makes no sense." "It will shortly." Holmes rose and began examining the room with swift precision. The rehearsal chamber bore unmistakable signs of recent occupation, despite its outward abandonment. A lantern. Empty food tins, fresh cigar ash, and upon a nearby table, sheet music. Holmes lifted the pages carefully. His expression sharpened immediately. "What is it?" I asked. "These compositions belong to Julian Merrick." "The assistant conductor?" "Precisely." Lestrade looked startled. "The man from the theatre?" Holmes nodded slowly. "He was here." The inspector's face hardened instantly. "I'll have him arrested." "No." "Oh, for heaven's sake." Holmes ignored him. Instead he crossed toward the far wall, where an elaborate network of ropes and pulleys descended from overhead beams. At once his eyes flashed. "Watson, yes? Observe this apparatus." I approached. Though dusty with neglect, the mechanism itself remained functional. Steel guide wires extended upward into darkness above. Holmes traced them carefully. They passed directly through the ceiling. To the attic? No. He looked toward the wall adjoining room 47. To room 47 itself. Understanding struck me instantly. The murder mechanism. Exactly. Lestrade stared upward. "You mean the blade descended from here?" Holmes nodded. "The killer never entered room 47 during the murder." A terrible silence followed. The victim sat below. Holmes continued quietly. "While the mechanism operated remotely through concealed wire tension from this chamber. But the hidden passage," I began, "a decoy." Holmes's eyes gleamed coldly. "Designed to suggest physical escape while concealing the true method." Lestrade slowly removed his hat. "Well, I'll be damned 3 times." Holmes scarcely heard him. He had approached Marcus Hale's corpse again. For several moments he studied the dead man intently. Then suddenly, "No, what now?" groaned Lestrade. "This man was not murdered here," the inspector blinked. "What?" Holmes pointed toward the floor beneath the chair. "No blood, no struggle, no bodily fluids consistent with decomposition." "Then he was moved afterward." "Yes. Why?" Holmes looked toward the ropes overhead. "Because someone wished him found eventually." A dreadful realization entered my mind. The grey gloves. Holmes nodded slowly. "Precisely. The mysterious figure from the theatre." "Yes. He wanted people to think Marcus Hale was the man in grey gloves." Holmes's face hardened with grim approval. "Excellent, Watson." Lestrade frowned. "Then the real killer disguised himself using Hale's identity? Or rather reversed identities afterward?" The inspector groaned. "You make it sound like a magician's trick." Holmes turned sharply. "My dear Lestrade, this entire case is a magician's trick." At that instant, something caught the lantern light near the far corner of the room. A mirror. Large, covered partially by dusty cloth. Holmes approached it slowly. Then he stopped dead. For reflected dimly in the cracked glass behind us appeared another figure standing motionless in the doorway. Tall, dark-coated, face obscured, grey gloves. Every man in the chamber wheeled around simultaneously. The doorway stood empty, but somewhere beyond the hidden corridor came the unmistakable sound of retreating footsteps. "After him!" roared Lestrade. Constables bolted instantly into the passage, while Holmes moved with astonishing speed. We raced through the narrow corridor, lanterns swaying wildly amidst confusion and darkness. Ahead came crashing sounds, a door slamming, then silence. We burst finally into the attic above the hotel, empty. Rain battered the roof violently while wind howled through cracks in the old beams. No trace remained of the intruder. Lestrade cursed savagely. "He was right there!" Holmes stood motionless in the centre of the attic, breathing hard. Then suddenly he laughed, not warmly, not with amusement, but with fierce admiration. He wanted us to see him. "What?" I exclaimed. Holmes turned slowly. "Our adversary has just acknowledged the game." Lestrade glared. "Game? The devil nearly escaped under our noses." "Precisely because he intended it." Holmes walked slowly back toward the hidden rehearsal chamber. Then he stopped beside Marcus Hale's corpse once more. For several moments he stared down silently at the dead engineer. At last he spoke. "The murderer has made one critical mistake." "What mistake?" I asked. Holmes lifted the remaining grey glove carefully from the corpse's hand. Inside the wrist lining, stitched almost invisibly into the fabric, appeared a laundry mark. 3 initials. J.M. Julian Merrick. But Holmes did not look triumphant. Instead, to my astonishment, his face grew troubled. "Impossible," he murmured. Lestrade seized the glove eagerly. "That settles it." "No," Holmes said sharply. "But his initials are inside the glove." "Yes," Holmes's eyes narrowed dangerously. "And that is precisely why they should not be." Chapter X. Holmes sets the trap. The discovery of Julian Merrick's initials within the grey glove produced precisely the effect our unseen adversary must have anticipated. Within an hour, Scotland Yard had dispatched officers toward the assistant conductor's residence, while Lestrade, flushed with long-delayed certainty, argued passionately for immediate arrest. "It's over, Holmes," he declared as we returned once more to Baker Street shortly after midnight. The hidden room, the stage machinery, the theatre connection, the initials. Everything points straight to Merrick. Holmes removed his coat with visible impatience, and therefore everything points away from him. Lestrade groaned aloud. "You cannot possibly still doubt it." "My dear Lestrade, I distrust any conclusion which arrives too conveniently. But the glove was planted, and the sheet music placed deliberately. The rehearsal chamber prepared for discovery." The inspector stared at him in mounting exasperation. "Then, according to you, every clue in London is false?" "No," Holmes replied calmly, "only the obvious ones." He crossed immediately toward the chemical table and lit a lamp beneath one of his glass burners. "You are overlooking the central principle entirely." "And what's that?" Holmes turned. "Our adversary wishes to direct the investigation." Lestrade folded his arms stubbornly. So a clever criminal conceals evidence. A brilliant criminal manufactures it." That silenced the inspector momentarily. Holmes continued. "The initials inside the glove were not hidden. They were meant to be found. Well, perhaps Merrick was careless." Holmes smiled thinly. A man sophisticated enough to engineer mechanical murder inside a locked room does not become careless while labelling gloves. Lestrade sank irritably into a chair. "Then where does that leave us?" Holmes's face grew very still. "Very near the end." I looked sharply toward him. "You know the killer?" "I know," said Holmes slowly, "what sort of man he must be." "That is not the same thing." "No." He lit a cigarette. "But it is sufficient." The room fell silent except for rain tapping against the windows and the faint hiss of the burner flame. At length Lestrade spoke again. "What about Merrick? Watch him. Not arrest him. No. And if he flees, he will not." Holmes sat down at the table and spread before him the architectural plans, theatre records and fragments, recovered throughout the investigation. I recognized at once the signs of one of his great mental reconstructions. He arranged each object with mathematical care. The silk thread, the burned ticket fragment, the mechanical diagrams, the locket, the glove. At last he closed his eyes completely. For nearly 5 minutes, neither Lestrade nor I dared interrupt him. Then suddenly he spoke. Elise Vernet, his eyes opened again. "She was the beginning. The aerial performer," said I. "Yes." Holmes leaned back thoughtfully. "Suppose Elise discovered something dangerous. What sort of thing? Fraud, perhaps? Blackmail? Theft? Something involving wealthy patrons and theatre connections? Adrian Vane," I suggested. "Possibly." Holmes tapped ash slowly into the tray. "She dies during rehearsal under circumstances made to appear accidental. And Marcus Hale investigates afterward." "Yes." "He disappears." "Correct." "Then Clara Marlowe continues the investigation." Holmes nodded, "and receives summons to room 47. Lestrade frowned. "But why willingly go there if she feared danger?" "Because," Holmes replied quietly, "someone promised proof." The answer seemed to satisfy even him. He rose abruptly. "Yes. What now?" I asked. At last the final shape emerges. Holmes crossed toward the mantelpiece and seized his violin. That alone startled me profoundly. "You intend to play?" "I intend to think." And with that he drew the bow across the strings. The music which followed was unlike Holmes's usual performances. There was none of the dreamy improvisation or fierce intellectual energy I had often heard before. This was colder, measured, almost mathematical. He played for nearly 20 minutes without pause, while Lestrade and I sat silently, amid drifting smoke and rain-shadowed lamplight. Then abruptly the final note ceased. Holmes lowered the violin slowly. "Watson, yes, tomorrow evening you must do exactly as I instruct." Lestrade sat upright. "You've got a plan?" I have a trap. The inspector's eyes brightened immediately. For whom? Holmes replaced the violin carefully inside its case. For the man in grey gloves. The following day passed in a state of extraordinary tension. Scotland Yard maintained surveillance upon Julian Merrick, who appeared genuinely bewildered by the police attention surrounding him. Adrian Vane, meanwhile, regained consciousness under guard at St. Bartholomew's and denied all involvement in murder, while admitting freely to arranging introductions between wealthy patrons and actresses. More importantly, Holmes disappeared entirely for nearly 8 hours. When he finally returned to Baker Street shortly before dusk, his appearance startled even me. He was disguised. The transformation had been executed with astonishing skill. Gone was the familiar gaunt detective of Baker Street. In his place stood a stooped, elderly bookseller with yellowed whiskers, tinted spectacles, and slightly trembling hands. Lestrade stared openly. Good Lord! Holmes smiled faintly in another man's voice. The disguise remains serviceable, then? You've learned something? Yes. What? Holmes removed the spectacles slowly. The dead woman in room 47 possessed one fact capable of destroying our murderer completely. What fact? Holmes's eyes hardened. She saw his face. A silence followed. But Vivienne LaSalle said no one saw the man in grey gloves, I objected. Exactly. Holmes leaned forward. Why would a criminal conceal his face obsessively among theatre personnel accustomed to strangers and performers? Lestrade frowned. So he'd avoid recognition. From whom? The inspector opened his mouth, then stopped. Holmes nodded once. Our killer belongs to the theatre already. I felt a sudden chill. Someone everyone knows. Precisely. Holmes crossed toward the fire. The grey gloves were never disguise alone. They concealed identity. How? Burned scars. Marcus Hale's scarred hands flashed instantly into my memory. You think the killer suffered similar injuries? Holmes nodded. Acid burns perhaps sustained during construction of theatrical apparatus years ago. Lestrade stood slowly. Then Marcus Hale identified him. Yes, and Clara learned the truth afterward. Exactly. Holmes's expression grew grim. She was murdered because she intended to expose him. But who is he? I demanded. Instead of answering, Holmes removed a folded paper from his pocket, a theatre programme from the night Elise Vernet died. He handed it to me. I scanned the names quickly, then suddenly stopped. At the bottom of the page appeared Technical Direction and Stage Engineering. Edmund Vale. I looked sharply upward. Holmes nodded slowly. The same false surname used to reserve room 47. Lestrade swore violently. Val, indeed. The killer's real name? Very likely not. But a chosen identity repeated twice. Holmes took back the programme. Edmund Vale vanished from Drury Lane shortly after Elise Vernet's death. Then why hasn't anyone mentioned him before? Because, Holmes replied quietly, everyone assumed he died. The room fell, utterly silent. At length I spoke. You think Edmund Vale and the man in grey gloves are the same person? No. Holmes's eyes glittered coldly in the firelight. I think Edmund Vale never existed at all. Before I could press him further, Holmes checked the clock sharply. Nearly time. For what? He reached for his revolver. For our murderer to make his final mistake. An hour later we stood once more inside the hidden rehearsal chamber behind room 47. The room remained exactly as before, save for one crucial difference. Marcus Hale's corpse had been removed. In its place, seated beneath dim lantern light and partially obscured by shadow, sat a living figure dressed in grey gloves and dark clothing, myself. Holmes had insisted upon the arrangement, despite my vigorous objections. You resemble Hale sufficiently in darkness, he explained, and our adversary believes the room now empty. You expect him to return? I am counting upon it. Lestrade and 2 armed constables concealed themselves within the service passage, while Holmes vanished entirely from sight somewhere deeper in the chamber. Thus we waited. Minutes passed. Rain hammered overhead. Dust drifted silently through lantern glow, and then, Footsteps, very faint, approaching through the hidden corridor. My pulse quickened violently. The concealed door opened. A tall figure entered, soundlessly. Dark coat, grey gloves. Face hidden beneath the brim of a low hat, the intruder advanced toward me slowly. Then stopped. For several seconds neither of us moved. At last the man spoke. His voice emerged soft and cultivated. "You should not have continued searching." In that instant I knew with terrible certainty that Holmes had been right from the beginning. This was no ordinary murderer. This was a man who regarded death itself as performance. Chapter 11. The Man in Grey Gloves. The figure took another measured step into the lantern glow. I had faced armed men before. I had stood beside Holmes amidst gunfire, pursued criminals through London slums, and once stared directly into the eyes of a fanatic determined upon murder. Yet I confess that no encounter in all my years proved more unnerving than those first moments before the man in grey gloves. Not because of any visible violence, but because of the dreadful calmness emanating from him. He moved with complete control, no haste, no uncertainty. Only the cold assurance of a man who had rehearsed every possibility in advance. "You are not Marcus Hale," he said quietly. I remained silent exactly as Holmes instructed. The intruder tilted his head slightly. "Nor are you the detective." Still I said nothing. For one dangerous instant I feared the trap had failed entirely. Then the man gave a soft laugh. "Dr. Watson," he murmured, "your loyalty to Sherlock Holmes does you credit." At that exact moment Holmes's voice emerged from darkness behind him. "And your vanity, sir, has at last undone you." The reaction was instantaneous. The man spun sharply, but not in panic, rather with astonishing precision, as though he had anticipated even this. A revolver flashed into his gloved hand. Simultaneously, Lestrade burst from concealment with the constables. "Drop it!" The intruder stepped backward toward the pulley apparatus. Lantern light struck his face partially at last, and I recognized him. Julian Merrick, or rather the man we believed to be Julian Merrick. Lestrade stared in triumph. "Got you now!" But Holmes remained motionless in the shadows. "No," he said softly. "Not yet." The man smiled faintly. "You continue to impress me, Mr. Holmes. Remove the gloves." A strange silence followed. Then slowly, deliberately, the man removed them. The skin beneath was terribly scarred. Chemical burns twisted across both hands and wrists in pale, distorted patterns. Lestrade inhaled sharply. "My God." Holmes stepped forward now into full light. "You are not Julian Merrick." The man inclined his head slightly. "No, nor Adrian Vane. No, nor Edmund Vale." A faint smile touched the burned man's mouth. "That name amused me particularly." Lestrade frowned furiously. "Then who the devil are you?" For several seconds the man merely regarded Holmes. At last he answered. "My name," said he quietly, "is Lucien Vernet." The room fell utterly still. "Elise Vernet," I whispered, "my sister." Holmes nodded slowly. "Yes." Lestrade looked between them in confusion. "Wait. You mean the aerial performer who died?" Lucien's expression hardened instantly. "She was murdered." "And you avenged her?" "No." The answer came with terrible coldness. "I investigated." Holmes spoke softly. "As Marcus Hale investigated." "Yes." "You worked together, for a time." Lucien Vernet lowered the revolver slightly, though he still held it ready. Elise discovered a blackmail operation inside Drury Lane. Holmes nodded once. "Adrian Vane's arrangements." Vane recruited wealthy patrons. Women were pressured, photographed, ruined if they refused cooperation. His scarred fingers tightened faintly around the weapon. Elise intended to expose everyone involved. Someone killed her before she could. "Yes." Lestrade frowned. "But then why murder Clara Marlowe?" At that Lucien closed his eyes briefly. When he spoke again, something far more painful entered his voice. "Because Clara betrayed us." A silence followed. Holmes did not move. "Explain." "After Elise died, Marcus Hale and I continued gathering evidence. Clara helped initially. She knew the theatre staff, the hidden rooms, the private entrances. And then She became frightened. Lucien's face twisted bitterly. Vane offered money, protection, escape. You trusted her, Holmes said quietly. Yes. The word emerged almost as a whisper. She arranged the meeting at room 47 herself. Lestrade blinked. What? Lucienne looked toward the adjoining wall, beyond which the murder had occurred. She claimed she possessed documents proving who ordered Elise's death. Holmes's eyes narrowed, but she intended betrayal. Yes, she summoned you there, and Scotland Yard afterward. Understanding struck me all at once. The message on the wall, I exclaimed. She expected police to find you. Lucienne nodded slowly. She planned to trap me inside the hidden chamber while the murder appeared impossible. Lestrade stared. But then who killed her? For the first time uncertainty crossed Lucien Vernet's face. I did not. Silence. Holmes studied him intently. You arrived after she was already dead? Yes. You hid in the chamber waiting for her. She never came. Instead you discovered the mechanism already prepared. Yes. Holmes's expression sharpened. And someone else knew you would be there. Lucien looked up slowly. You understand now? Holmes nodded once. Perfectly. Lestrade swore under his breath. There's another man involved. Exactly, said Holmes. A terrible quiet settled over the chamber. Then Holmes spoke again. The true architect behind the blackmail operation feared exposure from all sides. Elise, yes. Marcus Hale, yes. Clara, yes. Holmes's eyes hardened. And finally you. Lucien's revolver lowered completely now. I came to room 47 intending confrontation, not murder. You tampered with the mechanism afterward. Yes, to conceal your presence. Lucien gave a bleak smile. I knew no jury would believe innocence inside a hidden chamber beside a corpse. Lestrade rubbed his temples furiously. Then who killed Arthur Hale? Holmes answered immediately. The same man who murdered Clara. And who is that? Holmes stepped closer to Lucien Vernet. The man who ordered Elise's death from the beginning. Lucien's scarred face tightened. You know him? Yes. A dangerous silence followed. Then Holmes spoke the name quietly. Bernard Kessler. Even Lestrade froze. The stage manager? Holmes nodded. Drury Lane's financial records are catastrophic. Kessler's debts enormous. The blackmail operation funded the theatre privately for years. Lucien stared at Holmes with widening realization. You're certain? Kessler controlled stage engineering access, rehearsal scheduling, performer contracts, and private patron arrangements. Holmes's voice grew colder. When Elise threatened exposure, her aerial cable was sabotaged. And Marcus Hale discovered it afterward, I said. Yes. Kessler killed him? No. Holmes looked toward the empty chair where Marcus Hale's corpse had sat. He imprisoned him here first. A chill swept through me. Alive. For weeks, perhaps. Lucien closed his eyes in visible agony. I searched everywhere. Kessler used Hale's engineering knowledge to construct the Room 47 mechanism. Lestrade clenched his fists and afterward murdered him. Holmes nodded, then staged the corpse as the mysterious figure in grey gloves. The inspector drew a long breath. But Clara? Holmes's expression darkened profoundly. Clara Marlowe attempted betrayal on both sides. She arranged Lucien's capture while simultaneously blackmailing Kessler for money and escape. Lucien spoke softly. She underestimated him. Yes. Holmes's eyes drifted toward room 47 beyond the hidden wall. Kessler murdered her before Lucien arrived, then manipulated the scene to implicate whoever survived. A silence followed. At last Lestrade spoke sharply. Where is Kessler now? Holmes checked his watch. On his way here. The words struck like a pistol shot. What? I exclaimed. Holmes's gaze remained fixed upon the concealed entrance. I informed him anonymously this afternoon that Lucien Vernet intended to reveal everything tonight. Lucien stared. You used me as bait. Yes. And if Kessler comes armed, Holmes's eyes hardened like steel. He will. As though summoned by the words themselves, footsteps sounded faintly within the corridor beyond the hidden door. Slow, careful. approaching through darkness. Lestrade raised his revolver instantly. Constables tensed. Holmes stood perfectly still. The hidden latch began to turn, and from somewhere deep within the passage came Bernard Kessler's voice. "You should have stayed dead, Lucien." Chapter 12. The Final Performance. The hidden door opened slowly inward. Bernard Kessler entered the chamber, carrying a lantern in one hand and a revolver in the other. The stage manager's heavy features appeared pale beneath the shifting light. Yet there remained about him a terrible composure, the composure not of innocence threatened, but of guilt cornered too many times before. His eyes fell first upon Lucien Vernet, then upon Holmes. For one fractional instant genuine shock crossed his face. After that, remarkably, he smiled. "Well played," said he softly. Holmes inclined his head slightly. "You expected only one ghost tonight." Kessler closed the door behind him. "I expected desperation, not theatrics. The distinction between them is often negligible." Lestrade stepped forward immediately. "Bernard Kessler, I arrest you for murder." Kessler laughed quietly. "My dear Inspector, you arrest me with what evidence exactly?" Holmes answered before Lestrade could speak. "With enough to hang you twice." Kessler's eyes shifted toward him. "Ah yes, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. The only man in London who still mistakes cleverness for certainty." Holmes remained perfectly calm. "You murdered Elise Vernet after she uncovered your blackmail enterprise." "No. You imprisoned Marcus Hale inside this chamber." "No. You engineered the locked room murder of Clara Marlowe." Still, Kessler smiled faintly. "And can you prove any of it?" A dangerous silence followed. Holmes stepped slowly forward into fuller light. "You made one fatal mistake, Mr. Kessler." "Oh?" "You underestimated fear." Something flickered briefly across the stage manager's expression. Holmes continued quietly. "Adrian Vane feared you enough to abandon his identity entirely. Clara Marlowe feared you enough to betray everyone around her. Arthur Hale feared you enough to contact Scotland Yard." Kessler's revolver shifted slightly. "But fear," Holmes said softly, "always leaves traces. You speak like a philosopher now." "No, like a chemist." Holmes removed something small from his pocket, the burned glove. "You handled industrial acids regularly during stage apparatus maintenance." Kessler's face hardened. The chemical scarring upon Lucien Vernet's hands occurred while he attempted to disable your sabotage equipment after Elise's death. Lucien stared sharply toward Holmes. "You knew that?" "Yes." Holmes lifted the glove. "The same acid residue exists inside these gloves." Kessler said nothing. Holmes continued. "You forced Marcus Hale to construct the Room 47 mechanism because only he possessed sufficient engineering skill." "And afterward?" Lucien whispered. Holmes's eyes darkened. "You silenced him." For the first time, Kessler's composure faltered slightly. "You cannot prove Marcus Hale lived here." Holmes smiled faintly. "On the contrary." From inside his coat he produced several folded documents. Architectural supply invoices, food deliveries made secretly through old theatre accounts, and most importantly, Marcus Hale's notebook recovered this afternoon from beneath the pulley platform. Lucien inhaled sharply. "You found it?" "Yes." Kessler's face had gone utterly still now. Holmes unfolded the notebook carefully. "Hale documented everything. Elise's sabotage, your blackmail clients, even Clara Marlowe's attempt to betray Lucien Vernet." Lestrade stepped closer eagerly. "That's enough for trial." "No," said Holmes quietly. "It is enough for conviction." The stage manager's eyes moved slowly around the room, calculating, searching, like a trapped animal seeking final escape. "You think you understand this affair," he said at last. "I do." Kessler's voice hardened. "You understand nothing." Suddenly he raised the revolver directly toward Lucien Vernet. "She destroyed all of us." The words exploded from him with sudden fury. Elise believed truth mattered. She would have ruined the theatre. Ruined everyone connected to it. "She threatened your profits," Holmes replied coldly. "She threatened survival." Kessler's breathing had quickened visibly now. You know nothing about debt, Holmes, nothing about desperation. Drury Lane was dying. Patrons wanted scandal and flesh more than music, and so you sold women instead. Kessler's face twisted. I gave them opportunities. You murdered them. Silence crashed down. Then Kessler laughed once more, but the sound had become unsteady. Elise was an accident. No, said Lucien softly. She was murder. Kessler turned sharply toward him. You should have died with the rest. At that instant, his revolver jerked upward, but Holmes had already moved. Later, I attempted many times to reconstruct precisely what occurred in those next few seconds. I remember Holmes lunging sideways with astonishing speed, Lestrade shouting, the deafening crack of gunfire inside the confined chamber, lantern light spinning wildly across dusty walls. Then Kessler, staggering backward as Lucien Vernet struck his arm aside. The revolver discharged harmlessly into the ceiling beams. Constables rushed forward immediately, but Kessler tore free with desperate strength and bolted toward the pulley apparatus at the far end of the chamber. "Stop him!" roared Lestrade. Too late. Kessler seized one of the suspension ropes and slashed downward with a concealed knife. Something heavy crashed overhead. Holmes looked up instantly. "The platform!" A massive counterweight mechanism descended violently from above, smashing through the rotten flooring beside us in an explosion of timber and dust. The entire chamber shuddered. Kessler darted through the confusion toward the hidden stair leading upward. Holmes pursued without hesitation. I followed close behind, while Lestrade and the constables struggled amidst collapsing beams below. The chase carried us upward through darkness into the attic spaces above the hotel. Rain hammered the roof furiously now, while wind shrieked through broken slates overhead. Ahead of us, Kessler stumbled across narrow catwalks between storage rafters. Holmes gained steadily. "You cannot escape," he called. Kessler turned briefly while running. "Neither can you." Suddenly he kicked loose a support brace. A section of old walkway collapsed directly behind him. I barely caught myself against the beams while Holmes vaulted the gap with reckless precision. "Kessler!" he shouted. The stage manager reached the far attic window and smashed it outward with his elbow. Cold rain burst inward instantly. Below, far beneath us, the gaslit streets of London shimmered through fog and storm. Kessler climbed onto the outer ledge. Holmes stopped several feet away. "It is finished," Kessler laughed wildly. "You think prison frightens me?" "No," Holmes answered quietly. "Only exposure." For one long moment the two men faced one another amidst wind and rain. Then Kessler's expression changed suddenly. Not rage, not fear, recognition. "You knew from the beginning," he whispered. Holmes shook his head slowly. "No, but Clara Marlowe did." The stage manager closed his eyes briefly. "And that is why she had to die." "Yes." Kessler opened his eyes again. "You understand something else too, don't you?" Holmes said nothing. The murderer smiled faintly. "Lucien Vernet would have killed me eventually." "Perhaps. And you allowed him near me anyway." Holmes's face remained unreadable. I allowed truth its opportunity. For the first time, Bernard Kessler appeared genuinely unsettled. Then, before any man could move, he stepped backward into empty space. I heard Lestrade shout behind me. He vanished instantly into rain and darkness below. By the time we reached the street, Bernard Kessler lay motionless upon the pavement beside the hotel wall, while frightened crowds gathered beneath umbrellas and lanterns. The fall had killed him instantly. Rain washed silently across the stones. Holmes stood looking down at the body for a long time without speaking. At last Lestrade removed his hat slowly. "Well," said he quietly, "that's the end of it." Holmes's eyes remained upon the dead man. "No," he answered softly, "it is merely the end of him." 3 days later, the affair of Room 47 finally reached its conclusion. Scotland Yard suppressed many particulars from public knowledge, though newspapers nevertheless transformed the mystery into sensational legend. The hidden chamber, the theatrical machinery, and the impossible murder captured London's imagination for months afterward. Adrian Vane provided extensive testimony regarding Kessler's blackmail operation and received reduced punishment in exchange. Numerous wealthy patrons fled England quietly before formal investigations could expose them. As for Lucien Vernet, Holmes persuaded Lestrade to exercise unusual discretion. "You owe him consideration," Holmes said firmly. "Without Vernet, Kessler escapes entirely." The inspector grumbled, but ultimately agreed. Lucien disappeared from London soon afterward. I never saw him again, yet one final detail remained unresolved in my mind. Several evenings after the case concluded, Holmes sat once more beside our Baker Street fire, while the familiar fog drifted beyond the windows outside. "You knew Clara Marlowe intended betrayal long before the end," said I. Holmes nodded faintly. "She wrote the message herself." "Yes, but she also hid clues for investigators, because she regretted it." Holmes filled his pipe slowly. Clara Marlowe was neither wholly innocent nor wholly corrupt. Few people are. I considered this quietly. "And the title she gave the room?" Holmes glanced toward me. "What title?" I reached for my notes. "She referred to it in one statement as the dead woman inside room 47. Holmes smiled very slightly. How theatrical. "You think she chose the phrase intentionally?" "My dear Watson," said Sherlock Holmes, leaning back amidst the curling smoke, "everyone involved in this affair confused life with performance." He closed his eyes briefly. "Elise performed heroism. Clara performed betrayal. Kessler performed respectability. Even Lucien Vernet performed vengeance. And you?" Holmes opened one eye lazily. I merely observed the audience. Outside, somewhere beyond the fog-covered streets of London, a church bell struck midnight. Holmes reached absently for his violin, and thus ended the singular and melancholy affair of the dead woman inside room 47. Chapter 13. Watson's Final Memorandum. In setting these events to paper some years after their occurrence, I find myself compelled to include certain particulars omitted from the official accounts of the affair, not because they alter the facts of the case itself, but because they illuminate more clearly the singular character of Sherlock Holmes and the strange moral shadows through which he so often moved. The public, as is its habit, transformed the Room 47 affair into grotesque mythology almost immediately. Illustrated journals published wildly inaccurate sketches of hidden assassins lowering poisoned daggers through ceilings. Penny dreadfuls invented secret European societies and masked aristocrats. One newspaper even declared that Holmes had battled Bernard Kessler atop the hotel roof during a thunderstorm while flames consumed the building beneath them. Holmes found these embellishments intolerable. "Romantic nonsense," he muttered one morning while scanning the Daily Chronicle. "The British public possesses a lamentable inability to distinguish intellect from melodrama." "And yet the case was melodramatic," said I. Holmes looked toward me sharply. "No, Watson, it was theatrical. There is a difference, a profound one." He tossed the newspaper aside. "Melodrama exaggerates reality. Theatre reveals it." That remark remained with me long afterward, for indeed no other case better demonstrated Holmes's peculiar understanding of human nature. Most detectives seek criminals. Holmes sought performances, masks, false identities, roles assumed under pressure. He understood instinctively that nearly every human being becomes an actor when fear enters the soul, and fear lay at the heart of the Room 47 mystery. Fear destroyed Elise Vernet. Fear corrupted Clara Marlowe. Fear enslaved Adrian Vane. Fear transformed Bernard Kessler from an ambitious theatre manager into a murderer capable of constructing elaborate machinery merely to postpone exposure. Yet one matter continued to trouble me deeply, even after the affair concluded. 3 nights after Kessler's death, I found Holmes awake near dawn, seated alone beside the fire, with the recovered notebook of Marcus Hale resting upon his knee. The room remained almost entirely dark, save for the red glow of embers and the occasional flare of Holmes' pipe. "You should sleep," said I, So should London. You are troubled. He gave the faintest shrug, only reflective. I sat opposite him quietly. After some moments I asked, "What became of Marcus Hale exactly?" Holmes did not answer immediately. At last, Kessler imprisoned him inside the rehearsal chamber after Hale discovered the sabotage of Elise Vernet's equipment. For how long? Approximately 6 weeks. Good God! Holmes nodded, slowly. He forced Hale to complete the Room 47 mechanism under threat of death, and afterward murdered him. Yes, a silence followed. Then Hale himself constructed the impossible room. He had little choice. Holmes stared into the fire. His final notebook entries became increasingly disordered. By the end he understood Kessler intended no survival. I glanced toward the notebook. "You read all of it?" "Yes." "And?" Holmes's face grew distant. Hale described hearing rehearsals through the walls while imprisoned there. Music, laughter, applause. The fire crackled softly between us. He wrote that eventually the sounds became unbearable. Because they reminded him life continued normally only yards away while he disappeared entirely from the world. Holmes closed the notebook gently. A dreadful fate. I had seldom heard such quiet sympathy in his voice. Then why conceal portions of the truth from the police? Holmes looked toward me. Because Scotland Yard required a solvable narrative, not philosophical tragedy. And Lucien Vernet? He already suffered enough. I hesitated. You knew he intended to kill Kessler eventually. Yes, and yet you allowed him into the trap. Holmes exhaled slowly. My dear Watson, there are occasions when justice and law travel parallel roads without ever meeting. That answer, though characteristic, did not entirely satisfy me. You manipulated them both. Yes. You risked lives. Yes. You used me as bait. Holmes finally smiled faintly. And yet here you remain remarkably alive. I laughed despite myself. There are moments, Holmes, when you become profoundly irritating. So Mrs. Hudson informs me regularly. For a while neither of us spoke. Then I asked the question which had lingered longest in my mind. When did you first know Clara Marlowe wrote the message herself? Holmes leaned back thoughtfully. The phrasing. She opened the door herself. Exactly. What about it? No murderer describes his victim that way. I considered. He would say she let me in, perhaps. Or omit the detail entirely. Holmes's eyes narrowed faintly. The sentence possessed explanation rather than accusation. Clara wished investigators to know she admitted someone voluntarily. But disguised the handwriting to imply survival beyond her death. I shook my head slowly. She knew she was doomed. Yes. Then why remain? Holmes stared into the embers. Because guilt is a prison more reliable than locked doors. Outside the window dawn had begun to pale the London fog into ghostly silver. Holmes rose suddenly and crossed toward the violin resting upon the mantelpiece. You never published this case fully, said I. No. Why not? He paused with the instrument in his hand. Because people prefer mysteries which conclude cleanly. And this one did not. Holmes gave a short, dry laugh. My dear fellow, Bernard Kessler was merely the final symptom of corruption already flourishing throughout half the theatrical world. You could have exposed more. To what end? He tucked the violin beneath his chin. Society rarely objects to evil until scandal interrupts entertainment. Then he began to play. I shall not attempt to describe that music. No written language could adequately capture the strange melancholy of it. There was triumph within it, certainly, but also pity. And beneath both, something rarer still in Sherlock Holmes. Weariness. For all his brilliance, Holmes understood perhaps better than any man I have known that logic alone cannot repair the damage wrought by fear, greed, and human weakness. It can only reveal them, years later, long after the Ashburton Hotel had been renovated and Room 47 renumbered permanently to quiet public fascination. I happened upon a final, curious detail connected with the affair. An elderly stagehand from Drury Lane visited my medical practice unexpectedly one autumn afternoon. Upon learning my identity, He produced a folded theatre programme preserved carefully among his possessions. "You knew Mr. Holmes," he said. "I had that privilege." The old man nodded. "Then perhaps you ought to have this." Inside the programme rested a small photograph, faded almost beyond recognition. 4 performers stood together upon a rehearsal platform, high above a theatre stage. I recognised Elise Vernet immediately from the descriptions given during the investigation. Beside her stood Clara Marlowe, Marcus Hale, and finally a younger Bernard Kessler, smiling confidently toward the camera. Yet another figure appeared partially obscured near the edge of the photograph. Only half his face remained visible, but even after so many years I recognised him at once. Lucien Vernet. Upon the back of the photograph, written in French, appeared a single sentence. "The performance always ends before the audience understands the trick." When I showed the photograph to Holmes later that evening, he examined it silently for some time. Then at last he handed it back. "An intelligent observation," said he. "You agree with it?" Holmes picked up his violin bow thoughtfully. "My dear Watson," he replied, "the audience almost never understands the trick." And with that he turned once more toward the fire, while London's endless fog drifted silently beyond Baker Street, swallowing the city's secrets one by one. Epilogue. The last light in Baker Street. It has often been remarked by those who knew Sherlock Holmes only casually that he possessed no sentiment. Such persons understood neither the man nor the extraordinary discipline by which he governed himself. Holmes did not lack feeling. Rather, he feared its interference. He regarded emotion as a physician regards fever, dangerous when uncontrolled, occasionally useful in diagnosis, but never to be trusted entirely. And yet there were rare evenings after particularly melancholy investigations when some hidden inward burden revealed itself, despite all his efforts at concealment. The conclusion of the Room 47 affair marked one of those occasions. Several weeks had passed since Bernard Kessler's death. London, ever hungry for novelty, had already begun surrendering its fascination with the Ashburton mystery in favour of newer scandals and parliamentary absurdities. But Holmes remained restless. He devoted himself with unusual intensity to chemical experiments, violin compositions, and prolonged solitary walks through the city, at hours when respectable citizens kept indoors. One November evening I returned late from a medical consultation in Paddington, to find him standing beside the window of our sitting room with the curtains drawn slightly apart. The street below glimmered beneath recent rain. Gas lamps reflected gold against wet pavement, while distant carriage wheels hissed softly through the fog. Holmes did not turn as I entered. "You are late, Watson. A difficult patient." "Aren't they all?" I removed my coat and settled near the fire. "You have not slept again?" "No." Still thinking about Kessler, Holmes remained silent for several moments. Then unexpectedly, "About Clara Marlowe?" That answer surprised me greatly. "The victim? Yes." He released the curtain slowly. There is something profoundly tragic about a person who recognises evil too late to escape complicity in it. I studied him carefully. "You pity her. I understand her." Holmes crossed toward the mantelpiece where his violin rested. She wished simultaneously to survive and to redeem herself. Such contradictions destroy people. "You believe she regretted betraying Lucien Vernet?" "I know she did." "How?" Holmes gave the faintest smile. "The clues she hid." He lifted the violin absent-mindedly. "The locket, the message, the soot beneath her nails." "She wanted investigators to uncover the truth afterward." "Yes." He paused thoughtfully. "But not for herself." "For whom, then?" "For Elise Vernet." The fire crackled softly between us. Holmes settled into his chair at last, stretching his long legs toward the hearth. "You know, Watson," he said quietly, "the public imagines criminality emerges chiefly from monstrous individuals. And you disagree? I observe instead that most evil grows gradually through ordinary compromise." He tapped ash delicately into the tray. "Kessler did not begin as a murderer. He began merely as a desperate man, willing to justify increasingly smaller corruptions. and eventually found himself committing larger ones. Precisely. Holmes's eyes drifted toward the smoke, curling upward through lamplight. The frightening thing about men like Bernard Kessler is not their uniqueness, but their familiarity. Holmes inclined his head slightly. Very good. A silence followed. Outside, the foghorn of a distant river steamer sounded faintly through the London night. I found myself reflecting again upon Lucien Vernet. Do you believe he found peace afterward? Holmes's expression became unreadable. No. You think vengeance changed nothing. Vengeance rarely changes anything except the avenger. He leaned back wearily. Lucien Vernet spent years transforming himself into a ghost haunting the ruins of his sister's death. Such men do not easily return to ordinary life. You let him go regardless. Yes, why? Holmes considered the question seriously. Then, at last. Because he deserved truth more than punishment. That answer struck me with peculiar force, for it revealed once again the curious moral independence by which Sherlock Holmes navigated the world. He respected law, but he served justice, and the two, as he once remarked to me during another investigation, were not always reliable companions, Mrs. Hudson entered shortly thereafter carrying tea and several letters delivered during the evening post. One for you from France, Mr. Holmes. Holmes glanced up sharply. France? She handed him the envelope. I noticed immediately that it bore no return address. Holmes examined the handwriting silently before opening it with his penknife. Inside lay only a single folded sheet. He read it once, then tossed it quietly into the fire. I raised an eyebrow. No reply? No. From Lucien Vernet? Holmes looked mildly surprised. My dear Watson, you improve continuously. What did he say? Holmes watched the paper blacken slowly among the flames. At the end, said he softly. Very little. That is not an answer. He smiled faintly. No, it is merely the truth. I attempted no further questioning, for I recognized the familiar signal that Holmes considered the matter closed. Instead, I rose and approached the window myself. Beyond Baker Street, London, stretched endlessly, beneath drifting fog and scattered gaslight, a vast breathing labyrinth of secrets, ambitions, tragedies, and hidden lives. Somewhere within it, new mysteries already waited, new crimes, new performances. Behind me Holmes lifted the violin at last and drew the bow gently across the strings. The melody which emerged was quiet and reflective, carrying none of the fierce intellectual triumph which often accompanied his successful cases. Instead, it possessed the strange wistfulness of something half-remembered and already fading. As I listened, it occurred to me that the affair of Room 47 had disturbed Holmes more deeply than he would ever openly confess. Not because the crime itself proved unusually difficult, but because it revealed with painful clarity of painfully how easily intelligent people may become imprisoned by fear, guilt, and deception, until truth itself resembles merely another theatrical illusion. Holmes once told me that every mystery contains two puzzles. The first is how the crime occurred. The second is why human beings permit themselves to arrive there at all. The locked-room murder at the Ashburton Hotel solved the first puzzle brilliantly. The second, I suspect, remained unresolved even for Sherlock Holmes. Near midnight, the violin fell silent. Holmes lowered the instrument slowly and stared into the dying fire. Well, Watson, said he quietly, London sleeps. Uneasily, perhaps. He smiled very slightly, as it should. And thus, with fog pressing softly against the windows of Baker Street, and the last embers sinking low upon the hearth, the singular affair of the dead woman inside room 47 passed, finally, into memory.